This object was not conceived for salvation, nor was it intended for divine grace. Its true purpose was to circumvent mortality. While ecclesiastical authorities condemned it as blasphemy and monarchs denounced it as treason, the Knights Templar perceived it in a fundamentally different light. This relic possessed such immense power that an entire empire was ostensibly established solely for its safeguarding. When the fires of persecution sought to consume their deepest secrets, this artifact reportedly remained impervious to destruction. Consider a profound reinterpretation. What if the Holy Grail was never a mere chalice, but instead a sentient artifact designed to bestow immortality? Allow this concept to resonate. The narrative presented here diverges significantly from the historical accounts typically disseminated in educational institutions. It is not the refined legend embellished by poets or adapted for cinematic consumption, but rather a more archaic, enigmatic, and considerably more perilous account. Let us now proceed with this exploration. Envision a relic not crafted from precious metals, but shrouded in profound mythology. It lacks a definitive shape, an agreed-upon form, or a verifiable geographical location. Yet, the entire trajectory of Western mysticism appears to gravitate towards it, the Holy Grail. This phrase is so saturated with symbolism that many overlook its historical perception as a real, tangible, and even traceable entity. However, this is not a chronicle of Arthurian knights or romantic quests through fog-laden forests. This subject is inherently colder and sharper. Upon peeling back the layers of medieval legends, one discovers something far older beneath, a truth that reportedly terrified both the Vatican and the monarchy. This was not a mere vessel for wine, but rather a machine designed to manifest light. It represented not a symbol of Christ's sacrifice, but a crucial element for his resurrection. It functioned not as a myth, but as a detailed map. The Templars may have followed this map to uncover something too potent to ever disclose. This evening, our investigation will scrutinize the cryptic clues they bequeathed their symbols, their grand cathedrals, the mysterious circumstances of their disappearances, and most chillingly, their profound silence. For if the Grail was indeed a tangible entity, and if it conferred the powers suggested by ancient legends, then someone would either still be diligently guarding it or actively utilizing its capabilities. To ensure continued access to further insights that history has endeavored to obscure, we encourage you to remain engaged with this discourse. A notable characteristic of myths is their tendency to mature over time, much like a fine vintage. The specific details undergo fermentation, the underlying implications deepen, and along this evolutionary process, the original constituent elements often become entirely obscured. By the time most individuals encounter the phrase Holy Grail, their minds typically conjure an image of a jeweled chalice, perhaps gleaming with gold in torchlight, possibly resting upon a velvet cushion dramatically illuminated within a cathedral vault, or even concealed in the concluding scene of a forgotten adventure film. This visual representation has become deeply entrenched. However, here lies the initial inconvenient truth. The earliest descriptions of the Grail made no mention of a cup whatsoever. The Grail's inaugural literary appearance occurred in the 12th century, embedded within the verses of Chrétien de Troyes' Percival. Intriguingly, Chrétien never explicitly referred to it as holy, nor was it definitively portrayed as a cup. In fact, his depiction of the Grail was more akin to a mysterious serving dish, emanating an ethereal luminescence, carried in a solemn procession through a castle whose customs were never fully elucidated. It was a peculiar, dreamlike phenomenon, bordering on ritualistic theater. Subsequent poets and chroniclers, particularly the authors of the Vulgate cycle, began to superimpose Christian iconography onto this concept. Abruptly, the Grail was reimagined as the chalice used by Christ during the Last Supper, and subsequently to collect his blood at the crucifixion. Yet, even these sources display inconsistency, with some describing it as a platter, others as a stone, and a few as a book. One particular rendition even posits that it was not a physical object at all, but rather an profound experience. This inherent ambiguity is not necessarily accidental. It may, in fact, serve as a breadcrumb trail. The further one delves into its origins, the more the Grail appears to be less a sacred relic and more a proxy for forbidden knowledge, not wine, but illumination, not a symbol of faith, but a source of profound power. What elevates this beyond mere poetic conjecture is its precise historical timing. The Grail legends emerged concurrently with the rise of a formidable new entity in Europe, the Knights Templar. These individuals were simultaneously monks and formidable warriors, vowed to poverty, yet possessing staggering wealth, ostensibly loyal to the church, yet frequently accused of heresy. Their ascent was swift and spectacular, their demise utterly catastrophic. Woven through both their rise and fall is the pervasive whisper of a relic they either discovered or inherited, an artifact that fundamentally reshaped the very essence of their order. Some scholarly interpretations suggest that as the Grail's portrayal shifted from an ambiguous platter to a consecrated chalice, the accompanying narrative was deliberately retrofitted, purified, and rendered more innocuous. A powerful relic, once understood as a source of divine energy or ancient technology, was thus recast as a simple cup. This transformation was arguably driven by convenience. A cup is more readily explained. It fits comfortably on an altar, it integrates seamlessly into a storybook, and it finds an appropriate place within a museum. However, a deeper investigation, extending beyond the accounts of monastic scribes and courtly poets, reveals earlier Gnostic sects that referred to a vessel of light. This vessel did not contain wine. Instead, it housed a divine spark, a form of energetic purity intended to awaken the soul. These texts, as anticipated, faced condemnation. Many were subjected to destruction by fire, yet not all. Some were carefully concealed, buried in caves, only to be rediscovered in the 20th century, precisely when their contents could once again provoke profound discomfort. One such document, the Gospel of Philip, alludes obliquely to a bridal chamber ritual, wherein the initiate merges with divine light. There is no explicit mention of a cup, but a vessel is indeed referenced, not one made of clay or gold, but of the body itself, the human form, transformed into a living container. One might then legitimately inquire whether the Grail was ever about a physical object at all, or rather a transformative process. Naturally, the Church possessed compelling reasons to resist such an interpretation. A relic that defied institutional control presented a significant danger. It was far more advantageous to embed it within a historical narrative, to objectify it, to assign it a tangible form, to declare it transported to Glastonbury, or interred beneath Chartres Cathedral, or lost during the Crusades. By transforming it into a treasure hunt, the true essence of its meaning would be entirely overlooked. This strategy was, arguably, quite astute. The academic discourse surrounding the Grail persists due to the absence of a singular authoritative source or a canonical description, leaving only layers of metaphor accumulated over centuries of evolving contexts. Nevertheless, one constant remains: the Grail is perpetually sought, invariably hidden, and always inherently transformative. Furthermore, the linguistic origins merit consideration. The term Graal may derive from the Latin gradale, signifying a dish used in formal ceremonial meals. However, some etymologists propose a connection to sang real, meaning royal blood. Subsequent interpretations would splice this term into San Graal, or Holy Grail. But earlier readings suggest a lineage rather than a mere cup. This linguistic ambiguity, or perhaps deliberate manipulation, will resurface when we explore the Templars' profound preoccupation with sacred lineage. This discussion invariably brings us back to the knightly order itself. The Knights Templar were founded shortly before the proliferation of Grail legends across Europe. While this could be a mere coincidence, the pervasive overlaps are difficult to dismiss. Many of the Grail romances are set in regions where the Templars maintained active operations. Some even allude to a mysterious order of guardians whose solemn duty was to protect a relic purported to confer eternal life. A particularly enigmatic 13th century account describes an unnamed knight undergoing an initiation ceremony during which a luminous object is presented, though never physically touched. This object is characterized as blinding, emanating a distinct hum, and possessing warmth. Notably, no one in this account refers to it as a cup. All these points challenge the neat and simplified narratives often propagated within ecclesiastical institutions and academic settings. For if the Grail was never a cup, and never inherently holy in the conventional sense, then what precisely was its nature? Perhaps it was a memory of something real, deeply embedded within collective myth, or something still concealed, its true essence obscured by a millennium of translation errors and well-intentioned narrative revisions. Regardless, the contemporary imager gleaming goblet resting beneath a velvet curtain appears to be, at best, a poetic obfuscation, and at worst, a deliberate misdirection. It is often forgotten that early Christianity, in its nascent centuries, was not a monolithic entity, but a vibrant cacophonia swirling current of diverse voices, scrolls, visions, and gospels, many of which ultimately did not survive the rigorous winnowing process of orthodoxy. The Grail, elusive even in the myths where it ostensibly shines brightest, may owe its very survival to this historical suppression. For concealed among the ashes of forbidden texts are whispers of a vessel not fashioned from stone or silver, but from profound understanding, a container for divine knowledge, or perhaps divine memory. Long before the Church finalized its New Testament canon, numerous alternative texts circulated widely among early Christian communities. These were not peripheral documents penned by obscure mystics in back alleys. Many were revered, publicly read, and meticulously copied. However, over time, they faced systematic condemnation. Among these proscribed scriptures were Gospels attributed to figures such as Mary Magdalene, Thomas, Philip, and even Judas. Some were declared heretical simply for proposing that enlightenment originated from within, rather than being bestowed from above. Others dared to suggest that Christ's fundamental mission was not to atone for sins, but rather to awaken dormant souls to their inherent divinity. Now, imagine for a moment that one of these texts contained more than mere metaphor. Imagine it hinted at something tangible, a relic, a powerful force, or a discernible presence. The Gospel of Thomas arguably stands as the most renowned of these apocryphal works. It commences not with a narrative, but with a cryptic declaration. Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. The phrasing "will not taste death" is not the language of spiritual metaphor. It is a direct challenge, an enigma, and potentially a map. This gospel does not recount stories, delivers a series of sayings, even riddles. Many of these resonate as echoes of the canonical Jesus, yet others diverge significantly. One passage speaks of light within the body. Another refers to a kingdom not in the sky but spread out upon the earth, invisible only because people refuse to see. If one scrutinizes closely, or perhaps ceases scrutinizing altogether, it begins to resemble an initiation manual, not for a specific faith, but for a profound transformation. The Gospel of Philip extends this concept further. It describes a bridal chamber ritual not as conventional wedding imagery, but as a deep spiritual union. Christ is portrayed not merely as a savior, but as a revealer of profound mysteries. The text even ventures to suggest that sacraments, the physical rituals of Christianity, are devoid of meaning without this secret knowledge. One compelling passage states, "Truth did not come into the world naked, but in symbols and images. It will not be received in any other way." These symbols and images serve as cloaks for a truth perhaps too brilliant to confront directly. One might legitimately question if this was the essence of the Grail all along, not the object itself, but the profound truth that the object was intended to safeguard. The vessel was merely the delivery system. The true payload was something entirely distinct. Naturally, The Church could not permit these interpretations to endure. A relic that promotes self-transformation, offering a path to immortality through internal awareness rather than institutional obedience, does not function as a tool of salvation. It represents a fundamental threat to established hierarchy. This context makes it all the more compelling that several of these forbidden gospels were discovered not within monasteries, but in the Egyptian desert, interred within earthen jars near a location known as Nag Hammadi. They had remained concealed for nearly 16 centuries before their accidental rediscovery in 1945. When scholars commenced their translation, there was a brief period of intense intellectual fervor, followed by a discernible silence and suppression. Even today, many seminaries largely disregard them. Museums may display the leather-bound manuscripts, but they frequently offer minimal context, as if apprehensive of the potential consequences should the public examine them too closely. Within these texts, a recurring image commands attention, that of a radiant presence, frequently associated with knowledge, transformation, and a reunification with something previously lost. This imagery exhibits an eerie overlap with descriptions found in later Templar sources, particularly those referencing the cup of light, a phrase that appears in at least 3 13th century Templar testimonies recorded under duress. Herein lies the significant convergence. The Gnostic Gospels elucidate not a rigid doctrine, but a profound experience process of remembrance. Some scholars have quietly postulated that what the Templars unearthed in the Holy Land was not merely treasure, but these very texts, or their inherent oral traditions. If this hypothesis holds true, the Grail they pursued may have represented the physical culmination of a Gnostic vision, a relic that did not simply symbolize inner awakening, but actively catalyzed it. Nevertheless, a crucial caveat exists. While the Templars faced accusations of heresy, they never publicly embraced Gnosticism. However, perhaps such public adherence was unnecessary. What they discovered may have been meticulously kept strictly internal, a whispered instruction during initiation, a phrase meticulously carved behind a loose stone in a chapel, a manuscript painstakingly copied once before being destroyed. There is also the tantalizing possibility that these gospel teachings were not solely philosophical, but rather described tangible mechanisms, technologies, or methods for attuning the human mind or body to receive something far greater. In this interpretation, the Grail could have served as the amplifier, the divine instrument. Once utilized by Christ, subsequently lost, and then rediscovered by those willing to perceive its true nature. One may recall the earlier discussion regarding the peculiar use of the word vessel in both canonical and non-canonical texts, not merely as an object but as a metaphor for the self. Mary Magdalene, within certain traditions, is described as the vessel not for wine, but for wisdom, not for blood, but for memory. This metaphor, when pushed to its conceptual limits, begins to fracture, and beneath it, something more enigmatic emerges. Could she herself have been the Grail? This question lingers uncomfortably and will resurface as we later explore the bloodline theories attributed to both Magdalene and the Templars. For the present, the fundamental conclusion remains straightforward. The earliest Christian sources, those purged by Roman authority and buried in the sands of time, consistently suggest that the Grail was not an object to be physically possessed. It was a state to be achieved. The cup, in this context, was a deliberate diversion. The true relic was forbidden knowledge, radiant, and perhaps, just perhaps, eternal. A pervasive challenge with sacred objects is their inherent reluctance to remain static. They tend to migrate, undergo transformation, adopt new appellations, merge with localized legends, and ultimately leave behind just enough fragmentary evidence to incite profound historical speculation. The Holy Grail, despite its prominent European renown, may have originated far from the castles and chapels that would eventually become obsessed with its mystique. To trace its primordial essence, one must journey eastward to the foundational regions of early Christianity and even further into the enigmatic temples of forgotten cults. Antioch, once a resplendent jewel of the Roman East, served as the location where adherents of Jesus were first designated Christians. However, even prior to this, it had long functioned as a crucial crossroads, a nexus where Persian mysticism, Hellenic philosophy, and Jewish apocalyptic visions converged and coexisted. If any urban center possessed the capacity to generate a narrative as peculiar and adaptable as that of the Grail, it was Antioch. Local legends speak of a radiant object, meticulously guarded in secrecy beneath the city's great house churches. One account, preserved in a Syriac manuscript that narrowly escaped destruction during Ottoman purges, references a Klura vessel of light. Its description was not material but functional. It awakened. It did not dispense wine, it poured forth revelation. The phrasing exhibits an eerie proximity to expressions subsequently found in Templar initiation texts, and it is at this juncture that the historical trail begins to shimmer with profound significance. Not far from Antioch, traversing the ancient pilgrim routes into Judea, lay Jerusalem. In the 1st century, this was a volatile nexus of messianic cults, Roman imperial brutality, and spiritual insurgency. It was also, according to certain apocryphal sources, the location where an object of extraordinary origin was sealed beneath the temple, not by Christians, but by priests loyal to an older, more esoteric tradition. According to the Clementine recognitions, a peculiar text attributed to Pope Clement I, but seldom cited in official histories, there was a stone of flame concealed beneath the Temple Mount. It was reputed to contain the memory of the divine, and only those of profound purification could withstand its gaze. Most scholars have dismissed this as mere mystical embellishment. Yet, centuries later, when the Templars commenced their occupation of the Temple Mount, their activities were not focused on constructing shrines, they were engaged in extensive excavations. Between 1119 and the early 1122s, the recently established Knights Templar strategically located their headquarters directly atop the ruins of Solomon's Temple. For nearly a decade, they notably abstained from active participation in military engagements. Instead, their primary focus was excavation. The specific objective of their search remains a subject of intense debate. Some assert they sought material treasure. Others propose they were after ancient archives. A select few whisper that their true quest was for something interred by those same Antiochene mystics, something meticulously wrapped in linen and steeped in profound mystery. An account by William of Tyre, a chronicler not particularly sympathetic to the Templars, corroborates that the order undertook clandestine operations beneath the temple complex. No material spoils were ever publicly declared, yet the profound transformation within the order following those years is conspicuous. They emerged not merely wealthier, but undeniably stranger, more insular, and increasingly consumed by ritualistic practices. Their symbolism became denser, their architectural styles underwent a notable shift, and their adversaries multiplied significantly. Could it be that they unearthed what the Antioch cults once guarded, a vessel, perhaps, but not of wine or blood, rather of pure resonance, something that hummed with a potent, ancient power? Ancient Greek sources occasionally referred to Jerusalem not merely as a holy city, but as a node, a place of convergence, a portal. If the Grail was indeed some form of artifact, it may have been operational only in proximity to specific telluric energies or beneath particular celestial alignments. This phenomenon could account for its intermittent appearances, disappearances, and re-emergences across centuries, akin to a spectral entity altering its guise. Further complicating this inquiry is the discernible influence of Mithraic cults, which flourished throughout the Roman Empire. These mystery schools frequently incorporated an initiatory meal, the consumption of sacred substances, and the invocation of a radiant force believed to emanate from beneath the earth. Some Mithraic reliefs even depict a bowl not being held, but rather absorbing light directly from the neck of a sacrificed bull. While scholars often dismiss this as mere coincidence, the Templars were known to assimilate rituals from various sources. A few accounts even mention their profound fascination with Mithraic symbology, particularly the concept of light trapped within matter, awaiting its eventual release. From this point, the pattern further develops. In ancient Alexandria, a city equally imbued with mysticism, early Christian hermits meticulously preserved the writings of Philo, who expounded upon the Logosa divine intelligence that could be poured into those deemed worthy. In Damascus, apocryphal narratives recounted an unseen cup presented to the prophet John, intended not for imbibing, but for profound audition. The further eastward one travels, the less physical the Grail becomes. It increasingly resembles not a tangible relic, but a specific frequency, not a cup, but a complex code. Yet, buried beneath all these layers of metaphor, a recurring assertion persists that in the earliest centuries following Christ's death, a small, clandestine sect carried a genuine object with them, not for worship, but for diligent protection. It was never exhibited to outsiders, nor was it even named, but it was consistently described as warm, weightless, and perpetually veiled in cloth. Some accounts claimed it pulsed, others maintained it sang. If these claims hold truth, then the Grail may not have been an invention of 12th century French poets. It may have been remembered poorly, symbolically, desperately. As the Church steadily gained power, such narratives faced either erasure or systematic replacement. Thus commenced the transformation of the vessel of light into a simple drinking QPZ to depict, easier to control. The Antiochene origins were largely forgotten, the Jerusalem excavations reduced to mere legend. The Gnostic frequencies, the Mithraic echoes, the desert scrolls all were silenced, save for a few obscure footnotes in dusty tomes. Nevertheless, not everything was entirely lost. A handful of Templar parchments, presently held in private collections and rarely shown to scholars, cryptically allude to the light recovered beneath the mount. The phrasing is noteworthy: recovered, not discovered. This implies they were not searching blindly, but rather retrieving something they already knew existed. It suggests the Templars possessed a form of map, not of geographical locations, but of profound ideas, concepts deeply rooted in cities that had long forgotten their own pivotal roles. And perhaps, interred within the ruins of those cities, the unvarnished truth patiently awaits, not for the pious, not for the brave, but for the discerningly curious. They never articulated its existence publicly. There are no grand pronouncements, no papal acknowledgements, no scrolls proclaiming its name in the hallowed halls of Christendom. Yet, embedded within the whispered testimonies of tortured knights, within fragments of lost rituals and scattered accounts of their ceremonies, something unmistakably glimmers the cup of light. This phrase recurs not as metaphor, not as poetry, but as a stark declaration repeated under duress, as if seared into memory, as if something ineffable had been witnessed and could never be unperceived. The initiation rites of the Knights Templar remain among the most intensely debated mysteries in Western esotericism. While the order outwardly adhered to Catholic doctrine, daily prayer, vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, their internal rituals appear to have deviated in ways that increasingly disquieted both the Church and the monarchy. Eyewitness accounts from the Inquisition trials suggest that candidates were blindfolded, led into a darkened chamber, and confronted with something: a light, a relic, a luminous presence. One testimony, recorded in the dungeons of Chinon, asserts that the blindfold was removed only after a series of oaths were sworn, and upon the revelation of the light, the initiates recoiled from its intensity. The witness referred to it as the flame in the Grail, though he immediately recanted. Whether due to fear or prior conditioning remains unclear. Nevertheless, the phrasing persisted. Another knight described it not as a flame, but as a silent, warm glower presence without discernible source or shadow. He claimed it rested upon a linen-draped pedestal, and that no one was permitted to touch it, only to kneel before it, pray, and listen intently. Naturally, skeptics contend that these confessions were extracted under extreme duress, arguing that pain inherently distorts memory. However, even fabricated memories tend to diverge. These particular accounts, conversely, converged repeatedly. Different men from various countries, subjected to different interrogators, consistently spoke of the same phenomenon, a ritual centered not on a cup of wine, but on a source of pure, blinding light. This is where the boundaries of conventional understanding begin to blur. An obscure chronicle, attributed to an anonymous 14th century monk in Aragon, refers to an inner sanctum within a Templar preceptory, where a vessel of flame was shown to the brothers, and the oath of silence sealed by firelight. This description closely parallels the language employed in Zoroastrian fire temples, where divine wisdom was believed to manifest as sacred flame. Such a resemblance may not be coincidental. Some Templars engaged in military campaigns in regions where Zoroastrianism had left its indelible mark, potentially leading to the absorption of certain theological elements into their own mythos. Furthermore, there is the curious mention of the Bride of Light, a designation occasionally applied to the initiate in later interpretations of the rite. In Gnostic tradition, the bride symbolizes the soul seeking union with Gnosis. If such language permeated Templar rituals, it would suggest their ceremonies were not merely military oaths, but profound spiritual transformations. The initiate was not simply joining an order, he was undergoing a fundamental metamorphosis. What elevates these speculations beyond mere embellishment is the conspicuous absence of communion rites in many Templar records. For an ostensibly Catholic order, this presents a significant anomaly. Communion, the Eucharist, constitutes the very heart of Christian liturgy, yet the Templars' internal sacraments appear to lack any mention of bread and wine. Instead, they reference the radiance, the unveiling, the quickening phrases that belong more to the lexicon of alchemy than to orthodox theology. One peculiar record from the Inquisitions in Limoges describes a ceremony during which an initiate was asked, "Do you recognize the flame that lives beyond the veil?" When he affirmed, "Yes," the presiding knight reportedly declared, "Then you have drunk from the Grail. No cup, no liquid, only recognition." This redefinition, perceiving drinking as knowing and communion as awakening, fundamentally alters the nature of the relic itself. It is pertinent to recall that the term Grail did not originally signify a cup. As explored earlier, it may have originated from Graydale, a serving dish, or even gra, meaning a step or degree. If the Templars were cognizant of this, and if their rites indeed constituted a multi-layered initiation, then the Grail may not have been the object displayed, but rather the profound transformation it catalyzed. This interpretation would explain why no Grail has ever been definitively found. It was not lost. It was never intended to be found. It was a passage, a threshold, a flame that silently remade the soul. One of the more unsettling implications stems from a letter discovered in a private archive in Portugal, dated 1310. Unsigned and its authenticity debated, it describes a gathering during which the cup of light began to dim after the death of a certain brother. The implication is that the relic was symbiotic, dependent on a human presence to sustain its luminescence. If accurate, then the Grail may have required not merely belief, but blood, not simply faith, but a specific lineage. This leads us into profoundly uncomfortable territory, the notion that certain individuals carried an inherent quality within them, something the relic could recognize. Subsequent chapters will delve more deeply into this, particularly as the question of sacred bloodlines begins to gain prominence. For now, one fact remains undisputed. The Templars were not solely soldiers guarding antiquated relics. They were integral participants in something profoundly experiential. Their initiations were not about memorizing codes or pledging loyalty. They were about encountering an entity and subsequently enduring that encounter. This returns us to the enigmatic comment reportedly made by a dying knight during the fall of Acre. As the city succumbed to flames and the order was compelled to retreat, he allegedly whispered to a monk, "We did not drink from the cup drank from us." Whatever the cup of light truly represented, artifact, energy, or symbol, it left an indelible mark. And perhaps, just perhaps, that mark has never entirely faded. Listening closely, the narrative begins to flicker, not with concrete facts which have long since been consumed, but with pervasive echoes. Echoes of fire, of concealed light, of something transmitted not through scripture or force of arms, but through profound memory. Long before the Templars rode in structured formations, before Europe's inaugural cathedrals dared to pierce the sky, another tradition existed. It was quiet, deemed heretical, and deliberately consigned to oblivion Gnosticism. These were never a singular sect, nor a neatly defined denomination. Gnosticism was not a church. It was an innate hunger, an imperative to penetrate the veil of this perceived broken world, and remember, not merely believe, but remember one's authentic self, a divine spark ensnared in flesh, a prisoner of material existence. And somewhere within that intricate matrix of mystical poetry and cosmic geometry resided something they termed fossilite, not metaphorical, but an actual, internal incandescence. The parallels with the Grail are more than superficial. Certain Gnostic texts, particularly those unearthed at Nag Hammadi, describe a vessel not of water or wine, but of living fire. In the Gospel of Truth, Christ is designated a hidden mystery, a treasure which was revealed. His role is presented not as one who redeems sin, but as one who ignites knowledge, not knowledge of rules or doctrine, but of fundamental origin, that one originated from light and possesses the capacity to return to it, if only one remembers. This is a recurring motif: light concealed within shadow, fire encased within clay, divinity scattered like embers across humanity. And what is a grail, if not a container for that which burns? The tripartite tractate, another text from that cache, extends this concept further. It speaks of a divine voice descending through successive layers of reality, cloaking itself in symbols and in flesh until it could be perceived by those who slumber. The underlying notion is that one is not fallen, but merely asleep. And the Grail, when viewed through this interpretive lens, was not a relic, it was an alarm clock. The Templars, who are reported to have uncovered early Christian texts during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount, may well have encountered these ideas firsthand. Arabic scholars in the region, particularly those affiliated with Sufi mysticism, were known to meticulously preserve and intellectually engage with banned writings from both Eastern and Western traditions. If the Templars read these texts, or heard their tenets whispered, they might have come to perceive the Grail not as an object to be revered, but as a process to be initiated. This brings us directly to the concept of fire. In Gnostic lore, fire is not merely an agent of destruction, it is a catalyst for revelation. The body may be consumed, but the soul endures. Consider the text Exegesis on the Soul, which metaphorically compares human existence to a prostitute who must undergo purification by fire before she can return to her true bridegroom, the divine. This imagery is striking, perhaps disquieting, but also profoundly poetic. The Grail, in this rendition, is not a trophy, it is a profound trial. Not a source of comfort, but a moment of crisis, one that must be traversed. Now, recall the accounts of Templar initiations: the blinding presence, the silent heat, the light concealed behind the veil. Recontextualized, these appear as orchestrated Gnostic awakenings, rituals designed not to celebrate faith, but to ignite memory. The cup of light was not about revelation bestowed from above, it was about triggering an intrinsic recognition from within. That term, recognition, becomes central in the Gospel of Thomas. Jesus does not command obedience, he states, "When you know yourselves, then you will be known." There is no emphasis on sin, no requirement for atonement, only the imperative of awakening. This reorients the entire perspective. Suddenly, the Grail is not the ultimate objective of a quest. It is the catalyst that reveals one has already arrived. This is precisely where the Church drew its formidable boundary. For if salvation is predicated upon recognition, what then becomes of the priestly hierarchy? If divinity resides intrinsically within, What further necessity exists for confession, for sacraments, or for institutional authority? Gnosticism fundamentally dismantles such hierarchies, and the Grail, this luminous, ineffable entity that the Templars may have either carried, protected, or concealed, becomes the ultimate heresy, a relic that renders the very institution of the Church obsolete. One obscure account from the Cathar stronghold of Montségur, just prior to its fall in 1244, records a visiting knight describing a flame that sings but does not speak. The Cathars, with their Gnostic-adjacent theology, dualistic aesthetics, and reputed possession of fragments of forbidden Christian knowledge, align intriguingly with this description. This depiction of a singing flame echoes imagery from the Gospel of the Egyptians, another Nag Hammadi text, in which the soul is awakened by a voice of fire and breath. Thus, we begin to contemplate, what if the Templars did not merely protect the Grail? What if they actively sought to utilize it? If the relic or force they discovered beneath the temple was indeed rooted in Gnostic thought, it may have been intended not for veneration, but for practice, for profound transformation. And therein lies the inherent risk. Gnostics frequently cautioned that unprepared souls, when exposed to divine light, would recoil, descend into madness, or be consumed from within. Some texts even suggest that a failed awakening could lead to fragmentation, a spiritual fracturing so severe that the soul might be unable to return to its origin. The Church would label this possession, Gnostics would identify it as failure. And here, historical records offer a grim clue during the Templar trials. Several knights faced accusations of babbling incoherently, laughing during Mass, and refusing to partake in the Eucharist. Madness, declared the inquisitors. Yet, perhaps not. Perhaps these were initiates who had stood too close to the Grail and had fractured under its influence. This explains why the Grail legends frequently oscillate between light and blood, between healing and destruction. It lacks consistency, precisely because it was not intended to be a singular, monolithic concept. It is not a mere cup, it is a profound mirror. It reveals one's authentic self, regardless of preparedness. And this brings us to the question that has never been definitively answered. If the Templars truly possessed the Grail, and if it was indeed rooted in Gnostic power, why did they not employ it to save themselves? Why not awaken the entire world? Perhaps they attempted to. Perhaps some were successful. Or perhaps, as the Gnostics warned, it functions solely for those who already remember. High beneath the golden resplendence of the dome of the rock lies a secret, predating every prayer whispered above it. Long before the Templars established their headquarters there, even before the Romans carved their thoroughfares through Jerusalem, stood Solomon's temple. This was a site not solely dedicated to worship, but also to containment. Something was interred there, as countless legends steadfastly maintain. This was not merely treasure in the piratical Censino coins, goblets, or gold leaf, but knowledge, power, a vessel that did not merely store holiness, but actively generated it. The Templars arrived in Jerusalem in 1119, not as conventional conquerors, but as men driven by an unusual, seemingly divine mission. While their contemporaries were preoccupied with weaponry and salvation, the Templars made an atypical request, a lease on the ruined Al-Aqsa Mosque, then believed to rest directly atop the vestiges of Solomon's temple. What ensued was nearly a decade of discreet activity, not warfare, not diplomacy, but extensive excavation. Local accounts from that period, both Christian and Muslim, report peculiar movements beneath the temple platform, carts departing in the dead of night, foreign tools imported by sea, and guards stationed not along the city walls but deep within subterranean corridors. Something was being sought, or, more unsettlingly, something was being found. Solomon, according to the first book of Kings, constructed the temple not solely as a house of worship, but as a repository for the Ark of the Covenant itself, a vessel of immense significance. The Ark was said to house the tablets of Moses, and, more intriguingly, the palpable presence of Godan, actual, tangible force. Those who touched it without authorization perished. Those who merely gazed upon it in an improper state of mind were struck down. The Ark was not merely sacred, it was demonstrably active. Many scholars argue that the Ark serves as the direct prototype for the Grail. Both are described as containers of divine energy. Both are characterized by glory, inherent danger, and overwhelming radiance, and both mysteriously vanish from recorded history with an unsettling precision. However, what is less frequently discussed are the rabbinical sources, particularly within the Talmud and Zohar, which speak of hidden chambers beneath the temple, where forbidden items were meticulously sealed. The flame of knowledge, one such account terms it, purportedly encased in stone, enveloped in veils of darkness, and guarded by vigilant entities that sleep not. While the phrasing may be poetic, it could also be describing a sealed chamber containing intense electromagnetic energy, something that radiates even while deeply interred. It is tempting to dismiss these writings as mere allegory until one considers that in 1867, British explorer Charles Warren conducted meticulous surveys beneath the Temple Mount. He discovered an intricate network of cisterns, tunnels, and blocked-off chambers. Some of these had remained undisturbed for centuries. Others bore evidence of excavation long before his time. Warren's comprehensive report was suppressed. For years, portions of it remain classified even today. However, one specific detail became known: the tunnels did not lead in the anticipated directions. They circled, seemingly designed to protect something, or perhaps intentionally led nowhere. Now, recall that the Templars were present in this location over 7 centuries earlier. One of the earliest French Grail romances, Perles, refers to the Grail being discovered in a place of still air below the world, beyond the voice of bells. This phrasing is remarkably precise, almost architectural. Could it be describing a subterranean vault? And if so, who constructed it? Solomon, legend maintains, possessed knowledge not only of divine law but also of divine mechanisms. Apocryphal texts like the Key of Solomon, widely disseminated among medieval occultists, describe ritualistic technologies and instructions for fabricating vessels capable of containing the breath of the stars. Even if metaphorical, the symbolism is potent. Solomon, as the engineer of holy containment, the temple as more than a mere Shriniya type of ancient reactor housing a sacred charge. Some Templar documents, primarily fragments preserved in Portugal after the order's dissolution, cryptically refer to the Chamber of Convergence and the vessel between worlds. These phrases, devoid of context, might be dismissed as religious poetry. However, when juxtaposed with Jewish mystical accounts of chambers of knowledge beneath the temple and Islamic tales of the well of souls beneath the foundation stone, a consistent pattern emerges. Cultures separated by theology and language nevertheless point to the same subterranean space and speak of something profoundly sealed there. There is also the critical question of why the Templars selected that precise location as their operational base. Jerusalem offered numerous strongholds, towers, and defensible hills. Yet, they established themselves on the ruins of the Temple Mount, a site fraught with religious tensions, logistical complexities, and intense local scrutiny. This choice makes no tactical sense, unless they were drawn there by something beyond mere stone and symbolic value. Some believe that what they discovered there, if anything at all, was the original Grail, or more accurately, its core essenza relic, not of gold or ceramic, but of something unclassifiable, perhaps crystalline, perhaps luminous. Descriptions range from a palm-sized sphere to a plate inscribed with indecipherable glyphs. Whatever its form, reports consistently agree on one attribute: it radiated, and it profoundly transformed those who spent time in its proximity. A theory has emerged within esoteric circles positing that the Templars' abrupt shift in theological emphasis, their adoption of unusual symbols, their embrace of mystical language, and their resistance to conventional church hierarchy all commenced after their tenure in Jerusalem. It is as if they had encountered something that rendered the remainder of Christendom's doctrine seem incomplete. This might also account for the rumors that circulated after their downfall, accusations of idol worship, of strange heads or skulls purportedly brought forth during rituals. The infamous Baphomet may not have been a demon at all, but a distorted memory of the reliquar name appended by frightened minds to something they could not adequately explain. A vessel that glowed, perhaps pulsed, and defiantly challenged both scripture and hierarchy. We shall likely never know with certainty what, if anything, the Templars retrieved from Solomon's vault. However, the timelines align, their behavior conspicuously shifts, their language undergoes a profound alteration, and centuries later, no artifact seized from the Order was ever publicly displayed. No cup, no ark, nothing but ashes and profound secrets, which, upon reflection, is precisely what one would anticipate from a relic capable of awakening the divine. A curious and consistent pattern exists within sacred myths, a persistent fixation with blood. This is understood not merely as a symbol of life, but as a crucial key. It permeates scripture, ancient pagan rites, and whispered tales passed from desert caves to castle corridors. As the Grail evolved from a simple dish into a chalice, and ultimately into something far more enigmatic, one theme clung tenaciously to its periphery, like an indelible shadow that it was not only a relic to be discovered, but a relic that required sustenance. By the time the Grail legend had fully flourished within the medieval imagination, it had become inextricably fused with a second motif, one even older than the Crusades themselves: the notion that the Grail functioned not autonomously, but in response to a specific catalyst, a particular person, a defined lineage, a distinct kind of blood. And not just any blood, but sacred blood. This profound knowledge may have constituted the most zealously guarded secret the Templars ever possessed. One early Templar scroll, preserved in fragments within the Portuguese Convent of Christ, speaks in riddles of the spark that moves in the Red River and the vessel that sleeps until summoned by kin. While scholars often dismiss this as metaphorical, others interpret it as a coded reference to a precise mechanism, a relic that responds not to supplication, but to a specific biological frequency, something intrinsically embedded in flesh and transmitted through successive generations of bloodline. This hypothesis gains considerable weight when one considers the recurring Templar interest in genealogy. Several recovered documents, particularly those originating from the Languedoc region, include meticulously detailed family trees tracing obscure noble lines back to early Christian enclaves in Judea. Why would a military order dedicate such extensive efforts to researching bloodlines, unless they believed these lineages held something profoundly vital? Here, the complexities intensify, for tucked away within the folds of medieval heresy is a persistent theory, the Magdalene hypothesis, which posits that Jesus of Nazareth did not die alone and did not depart from the world without heirs. This theory suggests that Mary Magdalene, long mischaracterized as a penitent prostitute, was in fact his wife, or at the very least, his most intimate companion. Apocryphal texts, such as the Gospel of Mary and the Pistis Sophia, subtly allude to this intimacy, portraying her as the disciple who possessed a deeper understanding than the others. She is referred to as the vessel of remembrance, the tower, and the bride. If the Grail is not a mere cup but a living lineage, then Mary Magdalene stands as the primordial Grail, and her blood, or rather, the blood of her descendances, the intrinsic key that awakens the relic. Suddenly, the profound silence of the Templars gains greater coherence. If they believed they had discovered proof of a sacred bloodline, and perhaps a relic that interacted with that bloodline in specific ways, then secrecy was not merely prudent, it was absolutely essential. The implications of such a revelation would have irrevocably shattered the foundational tenets of the Church Christ as a man, a father, a vessel of divine frequency transmitted through birth rather than baptism, thereby rendering the institution of salvation obsolete through DNA. And, even more hauntingly, what if the Grail remained inert without this specific blood? Legends, scattered through Occitan poetry and Aramaic fragments, describe a relic that remained dormant unless touched by the seed of the teacher. In one Syriac account, a cup is presented to a dying sage, who holds it with no discernible effect. Then, a child, descended from an unbroken lineage, approaches, and the cup begins to glow. This narrative is either apocryphal, prophetic, or perhaps both. The Templars may have actively tested this concept. A record, almost entirely obliterated from the Inquisition archives, mentions a ceremony conducted in Rouen involving a young boy of Eastern descent. While the document is fragmentary, the Latin phrase "vivit calis sanguis infantis" appears. The cup lives, and the blood of the child. This account is unsettling and disturbing, yet it echoes the ancient belief that relics respond exclusively to those of a specific lineage. According to the record, the child was not harmed, but he was subsequently taken away, raised in silence, and meticulously observed. Later accounts from Cathar strongholds in the Languedoc region speak of light in the blood, and the vessel that opens only with truth unbroken. This recurring theme of genetic resonance, of blood memory, begins to feel less symbolic and more mechanistic, as if the Grail were a lock, and the lineage its intrinsic key. This might explain why the Templars never revealed its existence, even under torture, even at the stake. If the relic they possessed or protected necessitated a living component, a human catalyst, then its safety would be entirely contingent upon absolute silence. To name the lineage would be to condemn it. To reveal the relic's fundamental need would be to render it catastrophically vulnerable. It was deemed preferable to allow the Grail to recede into legend than to risk the hunting down of the bloodline. And hunted it would assuredly be. The Church, for all its splendor and power, could not countenance the suggestion that grace was an inherited trait rather than a bestowed gift that a relic could choose. Its master, that divinity, could reside in flesh, selected not by sacrament, but by ancestry. Such a notion would unravel the entire ecclesiastical structure. One peculiar detail is that certain Gnostic sects also alluded to awakened blood. In the Gospel of the Egyptians, a lineage is described as those who know from within the fire that does not burn. And in the second treatise of the Great Seth, the author, writing as Christ, states, "I came not for all but for those who were with me before." This phrasing is disquieting. It suggests a form of predestination, not spiritual, but corporeal. One might recall the Templar witness who spoke of the Grail drinking from them. What if this was not merely metaphor? What if the relic required contact with specific blood to activate, not as a sacrifice, but as a recognition, a handshake? This could also elucidate the peculiar behavior of post-Temple Grail legends, why it is never definitively found, why it mysteriously vanishes, why, when glimpsed, it is always brief, then lost again. Perhaps the relic chooses, perhaps it remembers. The question that now rises, unbidden and disturbingly loud, is this: if the bloodline survived, where does it reside now? And more importantly, is someone actively utilizing it? High in the wind-scoured hills of southern France, amidst limestone cliffs and tangled vineyards, the final custodians of a forbidden illumination made their last stand. These were not warriors in gleaming armor, nor priests arrayed in gold. They were heretics, at least. That is how the Church officially labeled them. Yet, the Cathars referred to themselves as bons hommes, good men. Their beliefs, though branded blasphemous, echoed something far more ancient, profound, and disquietingly familiar. By the early 13th century, the Languedoc region had become a fervent crucible of theological dissent. The Cathars adamantly rejected the Catholic hierarchy, condemned the material world as the creation of a lesser deity, and asserted that true enlightenment originated from within, independent of sacraments or clergy. It was unmistakably a Gnostic revival, subtly regarbed in medieval attire. At its core lay a profound mystery, the Book of Love, or the Book of Light, purportedly containing the authentic teachings of Christ, and potentially something far more. While no definitive proof exists that the Cathars possessed the Grail, legends persistently claim they safeguarded a relic, or perhaps a series of relics, of immense spiritual power not in prominent temples, but in hidden caves not adorned for display, but meticulously concealed. The Grail, within this interpretive framework, was not a trophy, but a solemn burden and entity to be diligently preserved, not openly exhibited. The fortress of Montségur, perched like a forgotten sentinel atop a mountaintop, became the Cathars' ultimate sanctuary. In 1244, following months of relentless siege by ecclesiastical forces, the stronghold eventually fell. Over 200 adherents were led into a field and subjected to immolation. However, just prior to the fortress's final capitulation, 4 Cathars reportedly effected an escape down the precipitous cliffs under the cloak of night, carrying with them what they termed le trésor, the treasure of the church. No gold was ever recovered, no manuscripts, no jewels, only a pervasive silence. What precisely constituted this treasure? Some theorize it was a gospel, others propose it was profound knowledge. Yet, a persistent undercurrent of belief maintains it was a vessel not ornate, not bejeweled, but simple, smooth, and warm to the touch. The Cathars, like the Gnostics before them, maintained that Christ's purpose was not to save humanity in a strictly legalistic sense. He came to remind, to awaken. This theological stance rendered communion irrelevant, made confession unnecessary, and effectively rendered priests redundant, thereby infuriating the Vatican. Now, imagine if the Cathars, much like the Templars, had access to something that elevated this theology beyond mere speculation. A relic capable of triggering spiritual awakening, Grail, that did not demand belief, but actively generated it through contact, through resonance, through blood. This is not mere poetic fancy, there are corroborating testimonies. A 13th century Occitan poem, likely smuggled out during the Albigensian Crusade, describes a flame in a stone that sings when the true ones draw near. Another fragment, preserved in the Codex of Foix, speaks of the vessel of the morning, hidden beneath the bones of the mountain, unlit except by living truth. While not precise, these descriptions resonate profoundly, and their timing is uncanny. As the Templars ascended to power, the Cathars vanished, not solely through coercion, but arguably by design. An alternative theory exists, suggesting not that the Cathars and Templars were adversaries, but rather clandestine allies and silent collaborators. The Cathars may have served as the Western custodians of Grail knowledge, diligently guarding it within the Occitan highlands, while the Templars facilitated its relocation or conducted studies elsewhere. The escape of the 4 from Montségur then transcends mere desperation, becoming a pivotal handoff. One narrative, barely recorded, recounts a knight in white armor receiving the treasure at a small Cathar chapel, then vanishing northward into Templar territory. This tale is obscure, transmitted orally, and documented decades later in a local monastery as little more than hearsay. However, it raises a crucial question: what if the Grail was never truly at Montségur, but merely passed through it? Then there is the intriguing iconography. Cathar cross-shaped engravings have been discovered at Templar sites. The patterns overlap, and the symbolism blurs. More than once, church inquisitors mistakenly identified Cathars as Templars, and vice versa, describing remarkably similar initiation rites, oaths of silence, and an overriding emphasis on light rather than physical form. It is plausible that these groups, both deemed heretical, originated from the same esoteric tradition. The Church perceived them as intrusive weeds, yet perhaps they represented twin roots of the same deeply buried tree. As with all matters pertaining to the Grail, the historical records are often indistinct. Documents were systematically destroyed, witnesses silenced, and the ground outside Montségur was not merely salted to suppress rebellion, but to eradicate collective memory. However, legends possess an inherent tenacity, and echoes are remarkably difficult to quell. Modern researchers who have visited Montségur speak of an oppressive stillness, a peculiar magnetism. Some report experiencing dizziness near certain cliffside caves. While anecdotal, so too was the concept of radiation once. One team investigating a cavern known as the Belly of the Mountain discovered carvings deep within, not medieval, but considerably older. Some of these patterns strikingly match those found beneath the Temple Mount spirals, circles, a cup surrounded by radiating lines. Coincidence is always a possibility, yet these patterns persist. Even today, the Cathar mystery resists conclusive resolution. The treasure was never recovered. The identities of the 4 escapees were never definitively established. And, curiously, the Church never publicly celebrated its presumed recovery, as if they never truly found what they were seeking. The implication is straightforward and chilling, that the Grail, whatever its true nature, passed through the fire and remained unconsumed. That its keepers, whether garbed in mail, linen, or the simple robes of heretics, ultimately succeeded, and that somewhere the flame continues to flicker. When a relic must disappear, its custodians are compelled to devise new modes of communication, not through words, which can be obliterated, nor through scrolls, which can be edited, but through the enduring mediums of stone, shadow, and light. Thus, long after the Templars had been systematically broken, relentlessly hunted, and ultimately disbanded after their sacred objects were seized, their records meticulously erased, and their leaders silenced. A final whisper emerged from the earth, disguised as architecture, a chapel, a complex puzzle, a silent confession, etched not in ink, but in geometry. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, by cathedral standards, is a modest and tranquil edifice. Yet, it has evolved into one of the most thoroughly analyzed and mythologized structures in the Western world. Its construction commenced in the mid-15th century under the patronage of Sir William Sinclair, whose family possessed long-standing connections to Templar remnants in France and Portugal. From the moment its doors were opened, whispers began to circulate that this was no ordinary chapel, that it harbored secrets no sermon could possibly encompass. Stepping inside, one immediately comprehends why Rosslyn defies conventional Gothic norms. Its columns are distinctly mismatched. Its arches are intricately adorned with peculiar botanical patterns. Angels are depicted playing musical instruments unknown in 15th century Europe. There are carvings of maize, a New World crop purportedly unknown in Europe until 5 decades after the chapel's construction. And, prominently displayed, hangs the apprentice pillar, a singular, twisted column, unlike any other architectural feature in the building, said to have been carved by a novice in a moment of divine inspiration, or perhaps something closer to a trance state. However, it is the chapel's symbolic language, rather than its decorative flourishes, that captures the attention of the discerning observer. Embedded throughout the structure are cubes meticulously carved with unusual geometric patterns. Some theorists believe these correspond to cymatic symbols, representing the visual imprint of sound frequencies. In essence, the chapel itself might be singing, not with audible music, but with spatial vibration, a frozen hymn. Then there is the so-called Grail sequence, a series of arches within the Lady Chapel that mirror the celestial positions of stars in the Orion constellation. Within these arches, a sequence of carved faces progressively tilt towards a central point, as if tracking an unseen light. At this convergence point resides a sealed chamber. Sinclair family records refer to it solely as the heart. This chamber has never been opened. According to a local legend, transmitted through generations of stonemason families, the chapel was conceived not merely as a place of worship, but as a map, a code, a resonance chamber meticulously designed to preserve, or perhaps awaken, something long dormant. This notion is not as outlandish as it might initially appear. Sacred architecture has historically been employed to harness acoustics, light, and symbolic alignments. The grand cathedrals of Europe were not simply constructed, they were meticulously tuned. If Rosslyn functions as a tuning fork, what precisely is it intended to resonate with? Some postulate that the chapel encodes precise instructions for locating or activating the Grail. One fringe theory suggests that specific chants, intoned within its walls, create a frequency that, when harmonized with a corresponding signal perhaps from beneath Solomon's temple or deep within the Pyrenees, could trigger an opening, not a literal door, but a metaphysical one. The Grail, in this model, transcends being a mere object. It becomes a profound bridge. What significantly strengthens this theory is Roslin's pervasive preoccupation with duality, light and shadow, male and female, waking and sleeping. One particular carving depicts two figures kneeling before a radiant object, not a cross, but a cup-shaped silhouette emitting rays. It is small, discreetly positioned in a corner, yet unmistakably present. Furthermore, there is the enduring significance of the Sinclair bloodline. According to certain Masonic records, the Sinclairs served as the ultimate custodians of Templar knowledge in Britain. They were master builders, astute stargazers, and diligent chroniclers of matters the Church steadfastly refused to acknowledge. Roslin, therefore, functioned as their sanctuary, not from human adversaries, but from the relentless passage of time, a vital seed vault for heretical memory. Some extend this further, pointing to rumored underground crypts beneath the chapel, said to house generations of Sinclairs, each interred with a symbol of light. The precise nature of this symbol remains unknown. The crypts are sealed, and the family steadfastly refuses access to archaeologists, to the church, to the press. One might recall the narrative concerning the Grail's requirement for sacred blood to awaken. Now, juxtapose that theory with the Roslin rumor that each Sinclair inherited something transmitted across generations. If the chapel was constructed to preserve resonance, and the bloodline maintained to preserve the key, then perhaps the Grail is not gone, perhaps it is simply dormant. A curious historical footnote involves the Second World War. Roslin was briefly visited by operatives from the British Intelligence Service. While official records state their purpose was to check for German sympathizers, they privately requested access to the crypt. Their request was denied. Whatever their suspicions, they were sufficiently compelling to dispatch two agents with direct authorization from Winston Churchill himself. No report was ever formally filed, leaving ample room for speculation. Even today, visitors describe experiencing peculiar sensations within the chapel, a subtle hum near the apprentice pillar, a sudden warmth in the Lady Chapel, and lights that behave unusually in photographs. Naturally, skeptics attribute such phenomena to the power of suggestion. However, if the Grail indeed left a discernible trace, a form of echo, then Roslin may well be the location where that echo persistently lingers. And why would it not? The Templars were as much architects as they were knights. They encoded what they could not articulate, interred what they could not transport, and protected what they could not fully explain. And within the enduring stone of this enigmatic, humming chapel, their silence may yet continue to speak, not in Latin, not in gold, but in pattern, in frequency, in light. It is tempting to simplify the Grail into a singular myth, one relic, one purpose, one definitive truth. However, relics, particularly those of profound power, rarely conform to such straightforward interpretations. This is especially true for the Grail, for as we trace its intricate narrative through the smoky cathedrals of Europe, the burning towers of Jerusalem, the mountain caves of the Cathars, and the cryptic architectural blueprints of Roslin, a distinct shift begins to emerge. The Grail, it appears, does not merely point in a singular direction, it bifurcates. In some accounts, it confers eternal life, literal corporeal immortality. In others, it bestows spiritual awakening, metaphysical transformation, the remembrance of one's divine origin. These two outcomes are not mutually exclusive, yet they represent profoundly different paths. What is even more intriguing is the indication that the Templars seemingly pursued both. Let us commence with the concept of immortality, understood in its most literal, non-metaphorical sense. Medieval reports, particularly from hostile chroniclers endeavoring to justify the order's suppression, claimed that certain Templars exhibited an unnaturally extended lifespan, that they did not age in the conventional manner and that a few, exiled to remote outposts or dispatched on perpetual pilgrimages, returned decades later, visibly unchanged. These accounts are vague, shrouded in paranoia and ulterior motives, yet they undeniably exist. A 14th century source from Provence notably describes a knight who returned from the east with skin unweathered, eyes clear, bearing no mark of the years. He was reportedly over 70 years of age. Naturally, these could be embellishments, legends fabricated around loyalty and fear. Yet, even within the Templar order itself, a sense of unease apparently prevailed. Initiates aged, commanders mysteriously altered. Now, juxtapose this with the second narrative thread, the idea that the Grail did not preserve the physical body, but rather transfigured the soul. In this perspective, immortality is not about evading death, but about fundamentally transcending it, becoming something entirely distinct, no longer bound to the limitations of flesh. A few Gnostic-derived Templar manuscripts refer to a second death, which befalls only those who fail to awaken. Others allude to the chrysalis of flames, suggesting the human form was merely a temporary, transitional shell. This divergence between corporeal preservation and spiritual elevation becomes increasingly pronounced the deeper one investigates. One illustrative example is the Testament of the Eight, a controversial document attributed to a clandestine circle of Templar mystics operating in the Levant. It delineates two distinct paths via corporea, the path of preservation, and via luminous, the path of ascension. Both, it states, are valid, but the former demands maintenance, while the latter requires sacrifice. Maintenance of what? Sacrifice of what? One theory posits that the Grail, if indeed it was a relic capable of bestowing either effect, offered two distinct modes, akin to settings on a complex machine. The first mode, associated with physical longevity, necessitated sustained proximity, direct physical contact, repeated exposure, and potentially even rituals involving bloodline compatibility. The second mode, conversely, was triggered by profound understanding, spiritual resonance, or meticulous self-preparation, and could not be externally coerced. It represented an awakening, not a reward. This inherent duality echoes concepts found in other traditions. In Hindu mythology, Amrita, the nectar of immortality, was perceived as both a physical substance and a profound state of being. In Taoist lore, the elixir of life could be alchemically brewed in a physical form or attained through deep meditation. Even early Christian mysticism, particularly within Syriac texts, speaks of two distinct gardens, one of earth and one of light. The Templars may have grasped this duality, or at the very least, encountered it. Some among them sought the Grail as a physical object to protect, while others viewed it as a metaphysical doorway to enter. Perhaps this explains why their internal teachings diverged quietly behind closed doors. One particularly enigmatic account, extracted from Inquisition archives in Toulouse, involves a knight describing a ceremony in which two initiates were brought before the cup of light. One knelt and prayed, the other stood and uttered a phrase no one could recall. The kneeling initiate became silent, radiant, and seemingly detached. The other was never seen again. The implication, however vague, suggests an element of choice or profound judgment. This brings us to the most difficult question of all. If the Grail possessed these capabilities, if it could preserve or elevate them, why was it not shared? Why was it not utilized to eradicate death and suffering? Why was it so meticulously hidden? Perhaps because not everyone survived the encounter. Perhaps the Grail was not a universal blessing. Perhaps it revealed, amplified, or accelerated whatever intrinsic qualities were already present within an individual. For those who were awakened, it offered transcendence. For the unprepared, it led to disintegration. This would account for the pervasive obsession with readiness, with secrecy, and with specific lineage. The relic may have been extraordinarily powerful, but brutally selective. And what became of those who received its enigmatic gift? One recurring narrative concerns a figure known as the Light-Bearer, mentioned in Iberian Templar texts as a brother who walked beyond death. The document does not specify how this occurred, nor what ultimately became of him, only that he was given to the Grail and did not return as flesh. A metaphor, surely, unless it was not. One might recall the earlier notion that the Grail could not be held, only recognize that it was not designed to bless everyone, but specifically the ones it chose, or the ones who remembered how to choose it. Perhaps this is why the Grail remains hidden. Not because it was lost, but because those who possess it fear the consequences should it fall into unworthy hands. And maybe, just maybe, because they are still deliberating whether the rest of humanity is truly prepared. There exist books that endure because they are meticulously copied, diligently preserved, and zealously protected. Then there are those that survive because someone, somewhere, recognized their inherent danger and meticulously concealed them. The lost gospel of the Grail belongs to this latter category. It is not its official title. Of course, it possesses no universally recognized designation. However, within the shadowed corners of obscure manuscript catalogues, whispered references allude to a text that ostensibly should not exist, that describes the Grail not as a relic or a reward, but as a profound paradox, a vessel that defies physical possession. It first surfaced in a footnote, the kind most scholars tend to overlook. A 19th century Jesuit archivist named Dom Marius Log was engaged in cataloguing unbound vellum pages from an anonymous monastic collection in Aragon. Amidst Latin prayers and faded inventories, he noted a curious fragment written in Syriac, a dialect prevalent among early Christian mystics. He did not translate it. He simply inscribed Fragmentum ex libro de Callalis Lucis Heretica Natura fragment, from a book of the Cup of Light, heretical in nature. This fragment mysteriously vanished shortly thereafter. Marius Log himself died under ambiguous circumstances during a fire that consumed a portion of the archive. However, references to the same phrasing, Callalis Lucis, resurfaced decades later in a private letter exchanged between two Benedictine monks in 1933. They mentioned a scroll of flame, likely, a metaphor briefly housed at a library in Avignon before being acquired by an anonymous collector. This constitutes the last confirmed trace. However, descriptions endure from the scant information available. The gospel, or treatise, or vision, is framed not as a historical account but as a profound dialogue. A voice addresses a listener, stating, "You seek the Grail as an object, you will fail. You seek it as a symbol, you will sleep. Only when you become the vessel will the vessel appear." That single line is sufficient to propel theologians into either ecstatic theoretical exploration or profound, silent denial. The text reportedly continues with enigmatic imagery, stars pulled from wounds, light that echoes like bells, a cup made of breath. It describes a relic that manifests only when three specific conditions are met. Though it never explicitly names them, it warns that to forcibly reveal its presence is to bring destruction upon both the seeker and the relic itself. And it concludes, maddeningly, with this: it is not lost, it is waiting. Not beneath, not above, but within. If this resonates as familiar Gnostic thought, it is but elevated to an unprecedented level of abstraction. The author, whoever they may have been, is not concerned with convincing the reader of any particular doctrine. They are issuing a profound challenge. The text is not merely informative, it is inherently provocative, designed to elicit a fundamental shift within the reader. This, again, suggests that it was not simply describing the Grail, it was the Grail itself, or at least a crucial component of its function. And here we arrive at the theory that continues to haunt scholars and mystics alike, that the Grail may never have been a singular entity, that it was always fragmented, distributed, encoded not merely in artifacts, but in words, in consciousness. That some relics were physical cups, stones, crystals, others were textual gospels, chants, books of light, and the final piece was the reader. One might recall how the Templars spoke in riddles, how their writings blurred the distinction between object and experience. A Templar codex from Portugal describes a relic that appears only when memory is pure. Another warns of false vessels items that superficially resemble the Grail, but are in fact empty. This aligns eerily with the Lost Gospel's assertion that form is the final deception. If the Grail intentionally conceals itself from the unprepared, then perhaps its written manifestation does likewise. Perhaps the Gospel is not so much lost as it is unreadable in a linguistic sense, but in a perceptual one. A book that appears as mere nonsense until one achieves the appropriate state of mind, a form of spiritual camouflage. Modern attempts to reconstruct or locate this Gospel have proven unsuccessful. Forgeries exist, of course, and reconstructions based on Gnostic texts, but none possess that unmistakable signature, that indescribable tension between revelation and silence that genuine mystical texts seem to radiate. One curious case emerged in the 1980 seconds when a researcher named Sophia d'Enfer claimed to have discovered a page of the Gospel hidden within the binding of a 15th century book on metallurgy. The page was later identified as a palimpsest, an overwritten manuscript, but the lower layer remains undeciphered. D'Enfer swore that the faded script described a thing of light that travels by memory. The page is now in private hands. The process of decoding, if it continues, has receded into silence. Thus, we are left with fragments, whispers, and half-burned metaphors. Yet, if we meticulously thread them together, a distinct shape begins to emerge, not of gold or gemstone, but of profound intention. The Grail, in this vision, is not passive. It does not idly await discovery in caves or crypts. It actively seeks understanding, readiness, and memory. The Lost Gospel, should it ever fully resurface, may constitute the final piece to prove the Grail's existence, but to prove our own, that we are not merely seekers of the divine, but active participants in it, that the relic we pursue is the very mirror we are often too afraid to confront. And if this premise holds true, then the Grail was never truly lost. We were. They left no gravestones, no recorded deaths, no illuminated obituaries in monastic scrolls, only a profound silence. A small contingent of Templar knights, assigned a discreet mission in the twilight of the Order's power, vanished somewhere between Jerusalem and Axum, the ancient Ethiopian capital, renowned more for its myths than its verifiable geography. This was not a battlefield assignment, nor was it even officially sanctioned. However, for those who have meticulously tracked the veiled movements of the Grail, their specific trajectory holds greater significance than any crusade. Officially, the historical records are sparse. Yet, in the archives of Cistercian monasteries, particularly those closely affiliated with the Templar Order, there are mentions of an eastern path undertaken by 7 Brothers of the Cross, tasked with retrieving knowledge preserved before the flood. This phrasing is peculiar, even by Templar standards. Most assume it refers to ancient scriptures. However, one footnote partially faded and nearly illegible refers to the vessel that predates Babel. The implication is that whatever they sought was older than even the earliest Christian relics, possibly pre-Abrahamic. Thus, they journeyed south, beyond Jerusalem, beyond the Sinai, deep into Egypt, and from there, by merchant caravan and river passage, towards the highlands of Ethiopia. The route they selected mirrored one previously traced by earlier Gnostic traders and monastics. For while Jerusalem may be perceived as the pulsating heart of Christian lore, Ethiopia houses its lungs ancient, profound, and still actively breathing. What is striking is that their chosen route was not merely perilucid, was deliberately obscure. They actively avoided Roman roads, adhering instead to paths utilized by Coptic pilgrims, Sufi mystics, and the last remnants of Jewish tribes who had long since departed from the Levant. This was not a military expedition, it was a pilgrimage, or more precisely, a retrieval mission. Why Ethiopia? because within its rugged hills, churches were not constructed upon the land, they were meticulously carved into it. King Lalibela, the legendary ruler who reigned in the 12th century, commissioned 11 such structure-as monolithic sanctuaries, chiseled directly from solid bedrock. Some assert that angels assisted him, others whisper that he was simply shown how. Within these churches lies symbolism that is strangely, uncomfortably European crosses that bear a striking resemblance to those on the Templar seal, and altars positioned in orientations that match Rosslyn Chapel's celestial echoes. But even more significant is Axum, the ancient capital and spiritual epicenter of Ethiopian orthodoxy. It is here, in the Chapel of the Tablet, that monks assert the Ark of the Covenant definitively resides not metaphorically, but literally. It is guarded by a single, lifelong custodian who never departs from the chamber, never converses with outsiders, and ultimately dies within its sacred confines. This is a claim so audacious that most historians dismiss it outright. And yet, no one is ever permitted to view its interior. Now, consider this. What if the Templars did not come to purloin the Ark, but rather to compare it? A theory, murky and seldom articulated, suggests that the Grail and the Ark are twin relics, not duplicates, but complementary halves. One holds divine law, the other, divine transformation. The Ark represents structure, the Grail, awakening, order, and chaos. If this premise were accurate, it would logically follow that the Templars would seek out the Ark, not to claim it, but to comprehend the Grail through its sibling. Further clues exist. In the margins of a Portuguese Templar codex, a scribe mentions the Brothers of the Red Suna, probable reference to the Ethiopian highland sand states. They sought not the relic itself, but the memory of it housed in fire. This final phrase resonates with language found in the Lost Gospel, where the Grail is described as living fire stored in clay. It is not a significant leap to imagine that the Grail, or something akin to it, may have passed through Ethiopia in the early Christian era. The country's ancient Judaic-Christian tradition includes narratives of luminous tablets, of vessels meticulously carved from peculiar stone, and of rituals that burn but do not consume. And then there is the Kebra Nagast, the Ethiopian national epic, which describes how the Queen of Sheba bore a son by King Solomon, and that their descendants carried with them not only the Ark, but also a wisdom unspoken in the Hebrew canon. If that wisdom was technological or energetic in nature, it might explain why the Templars risked everything to reach it. But what became of the 7 knights? There are no records of their return, no letters, no funerals, no relics definitively traced back to Thmonli silence. However, a tantalizing clue surfaces in a 17th century Jesuit report, which describes a remote Christian enclave in the Ethiopian highlands that sings prayers in strange tongues and preserves images of knights in white. The priest who authored the report noted that these Christians claimed descent from brothers who came from the north seeking the sleeping stone. Again, the phrasing is elusive, yet compelling. The report was subsequently suppressed. Later, during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in the 20th century, many of the region's monasteries were plundered or destroyed. Whatever artifacts might have connected these pilgrims to their Templar predecessors were either lost or once again interred. Nevertheless, local legend remembers them. Some Ethiopian elders, when questioned about foreign visitors in ancient times, speak of men who came with fire on their shoulders, walked without fear, and inquired about the heart of the mountain. In one version, they reached a monastery carved into a cliffside. There, a monk presented them with a book that sang not metaphorically, but audibly. And from that moment onward, the knights reportedly never spoke again. They remained, or dissolved, or simply vanished into the light. This account is undoubtedly fanciful and folkloric. Yet, it is no more extraordinary than the other Grail narratives we have explored. And if there is any truth to it, even a sliver, then the quest for the Grail did not conclude in Europe or the Levant. It extended deep into Africa, into an ancient kingdom that safeguarded not merely relics, but profound relationships between the divine and the human. the forgotten and the remembered, the mortal and the immortal. And those nights, perhaps, they ultimately found what they sought, or perhaps they were never truly destined to return. Concealed behind a wrought iron gate, enveloped in profound silence, and guarded by a solitary monk who will never depart from its side, rests the most sacred object in all of Ethiopia, the Ark of the Covenant. Or so the claim maintains. It is neither displayed nor paraded. No pilgrim is ever permitted to behold it. Yet, millions believe it resides there, within Aksum's chapel of the Tablita sealed room, a single unwavering guardian, and perhaps the other half of a secret older than Christendom itself. The Ark has consistently captivated the Western imagination, particularly as the purported container for the tablets of Moses' divine law inscribed in stone. However, in Ethiopian lore, its significance transcends this. The Kebra Nagast, a 14th century chronicle detailing Ethiopian royal lineage and spiritual destiny, declares that the Ark was brought to Ethiopia by Menelik I, the son of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. He did not steal either inherited it, as if it were not merely a relic of Israelite religion, but a component of something far grander, a legacy transmitted through blood. This establishes a fascinating parallel. If the Ark journeyed south through Solomon's lineage, and if the Grail, as some suspect, passed through Christ's lineage, and if these two lines once converged, then perhaps the Grail and the Ark were never adversaries but complementary twins, one representing command, the other memory only embodying law, the other light. It is tempting to interpret this entirely as metaphor. However, Ethiopia does not treat it in such a manner. Their churches are meticulously designed around the Ark. Every Orthodox sanctuary possesses a tabot, a symbolic replica of the Ark housed within the Holy of Holies. This is not merely tradition, it is cosmology. They believe the Ark to be a living presence, active, powerful, and communicative. It does not merely symbolize the divine, it actually contains it. Now, imagine a relic, the Grail, that requires such a presence to function, a co-relic, a pairing, something that awakens only when its counterpart is in proximity. If this holds true, then Ethiopia would not merely be a sanctuary for one sacred object. It would be the unique location where the full equation can still achieve balance. Moreover, Ethiopian legends speak of a light of judgment, an object sealed alongside the Ark that glows in the presence of specific individuals. It is never displayed, never explicitly named, yet oral traditions describe it as a cup of flame, or occasionally the mouth of silence. Again, vague but hauntingly familiar, a cup that reveals, a vessel that speaks. These phrases demonstrate a significant overlap with language found in Cathar testimonies and the so-called lost gospel, suggesting not mere coincidence, but a shared source. One narrative, transmitted among the Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews with traditions diverging from rabbinic norms, recounts a vessel that came from the stars, hidden in stone by those who speak without tongues. It was said to be alive, and it only opened when the blood remembered. This theme of recognition, of compatibility, recurs across continents, cultures, and centuries, and Ethiopia consistently remains at its nexus. The Templars, as previously noted, dispatched pilgrims southward. Yet, a persistent theory suggests that not all of them returned, choosing instead to remain. Some reportedly integrated into local Christian enclaves, sharing knowledge, and perhaps even relics. It has been observed that certain highland Ethiopian crosses bear motifs eerily similar to Templar seals, interlocking loops, sacred geometry, and sunburst designs. These could be coincidental, or they could represent enduring traces. Then there is the phenomenon of Debre Damo, a remote monastery accessible solely by rope, inhabited exclusively by men, and home to manuscripts no outsider has ever catalogued. One traveler, writing in the 19th century, claimed to have glimpsed a codex that spoke of the vessel not made by man which sings when the stars turn. He was not permitted to read it, nor to touch it. He never returned. Modern researchers, at least those who approach with sensitivity, have observed that local clergy frequently respond evasively to inquiries about relics beyond the Ark. This is not out of superstition, but rather profound protection. The implication is clear: they are not merely guarding history, they are safeguarding something else, something still active. One monk, interviewed anonymously by an ethnographer in the 1970 seconds, stated, "You come looking for a box, but the box is not the treasure. The box is the keeper of the voice. The voice chooses when it speaks." This echoes earlier Grail legends, the idea that the relic reveals itself only to those who are prepared, that it cannot be forced, that mere proximity is meaningless without the correct vibration, blood, or memory. In this context, Ethiopia may be more than a mere resting place. It may represent the last remaining environment where the Grail, if it is indeed realer, partially real, or spiritually real, can still operate. For here, the cosmology has remained unaltered, the rituals unsterilized, the stories unrewritten. They have been whispered, meticulously preserved, and carried forward by monks who anticipate no audience, no acclaim, no cathedral spotlight. This renders Ethiopia perilous to the official narrative. It is too ancient, too intact, too resistant to external control. This may explain why Western powers, from colonial agents to religious emissaries, have attempted and failed to extract its secrets. For Ethiopia does not merely hoard relics, it remembers them. Thus, the theory persists that the Grail is not interred in Europe or lost within some alpine cave. It is in exile, resting beside its older sibling, the Ark, awaiting reunion, awaiting remembrance, awaiting the one who possesses the innate ability to listen. For in this land of carved churches and silent guardians, the relics are not lost, they are simply waiting. The genesis of many mysteries, including this one, lies in inherent contradiction. Officially, the Templars were not alchemists, they were knights, monastic warriors bound by vows of poverty, obedience, and the defense of the Holy Land. Yet, scattered amidst the ruins of their commanderies, subtly tucked into the margins of their prayer books, and integrated into architectural flourishes, are symbols that seem incongruous with their stated purpose. Suns with human faces, serpents consuming their own tails, interlaced circles, the distinct language of alchemy, concealed yet unmistakable. Alchemy, within the medieval mindset, was not solely concerned with the transmutation of lead into gold that was a convenient obfuscation for the uninitiated. True alchemy aimed at transfiguration, not merely of matter, but of spirit. The opus magnum represented the profound transformation of the self, the awakening of divine light within the mortal vessel. If this concept resonates as familiar, it is, in essence, the Grail quest by another designation. One particular symbol recurs consistently in both Templar and alchemical texts, the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, said to be the ultimate product of the great work. This stone was not a mere mineral, but a living matrix, a sentient artifact purported to confer not only healing but profound illumination. Its descriptions demonstrate an almost unnerving overlap with those of the Grail: radiant, elusive, intrinsically linked to purity, and accessible exclusively to those who had undergone deep inner transformation. More intriguingly, some esoteric texts, particularly those associated with the Iberian Templars, describe a relic known as the Stone That Speaks. One scroll, attributed to the clandestine Order of the Star in the West, refers to a ritual in which a stone of light is bathed in sunrise and sings back the name of the soul. Whether this is metaphor or an actual mechanism, its resonance with Grail imagery is undeniable. A vessel of divine energy activated not by conventional physical means, but by a precise alignment. Now, consider this proposition. What if the Grail and the Philosopher's Stone were not separate legends, but rather fragmented memories of the same underlying device? This theory is bolstered by linguistic overlaps. In certain Arabic alchemical texts, which the Templars may have encountered during their time in the Holy Land, the elixir, or elixir of life, is described as a liquid stony, a contradiction in terms, unless the object is of a more exotic nature, perhaps crystalline, perhaps energetic, something neither fully material nor entirely symbolic, a relic that somehow embodies both states, born from a fusion of physics and prayer. There is also the peculiar matter of the Templars' profound interest in sacred geometry. Many of their chapels and commanderies were constructed with unusual alignments, not merely with solstices or cardinal points, but with each other, as if forming an intricate network, a lattice, a map. One modern researcher observed that several Templar sites, when connected by lines, form patterns consistent with Hermetic sigils, ancient symbols, designed to channel or contain divine force. Again, this points to architecture as containment, buildings as vessels, which brings us back to the Grail. What if it was not an object within the chapel, but the chapel itself? Or rather, a combination of object and space, relic and resonance chamber device that activates only under specific vibrational conditions. In this model, the Grail becomes less a portable cup and more a type of engine, one that must be harmonized, like a tuning fork, with its environment and its designated bearer. A rare and seldom told narrative recounts a Templar who, upon returning from the East, never removed his gauntlet. When questioned, he reportedly replied, "Because it still burns." His hand, it was said, had touched the stone of awakening, and from that moment he could no longer sleep, nor perceive cold, nor tolerate the company of others. Whether factual or legendary, this tale underscores a consistent idea that contact with the Grail was not merely transformative, but profoundly destabilizing, a form of spiritual radiation. The Cathars alluded to something similar. One of their preserved sayings refers to the fire that leaves the hand but not the heart. Again, the emphasis is not on ownership, but on profound internal change. The Grail does not merely belong, it becomes. And what of the failed initiates? Alchemical lore is replete with warnings that attempting the great work without prior purification leads invariably to madness, to combustion, to ruin. Similarly, Grail lore is populated by knights who discovered the relic only to be irrevocably destroyed by it, the Fisher King, whose wound never heals Galahad, who mysteriously vanishes Percival, who poses the incorrect question. These are not merely narrative devices, they function as potent cautionary tales. The Grail, much like the stone, exercises judgment. One alchemical treatise, concealed for centuries in a monastery near Tomar, describes a relic of doubled nature, forged not by hands but by will. It designates it lapis memorialtha, stone of memory, said to restore the divine pattern within the bearer. This implies not simply immortality, but a profound remembrance. This connects directly with the Gnostic concept that salvation is not granted, but rather recalled, that the divine spark is intrinsically present and merely requires reignition. In this interpretation, the Grail is not a blessing, it is a profound test, a final calibration of the soul's preparedness to revert to its primordial state before the embodiment of flesh. And alchemy, with its obscure symbols and perilous metaphors, was the chosen language to safeguard that profound knowledge. Why? Because ink is legible to anyone, but symbols demand decoding, and only those who are truly prepared possess the capacity to decipher them. Thus, the Grail endures as a cup, a stone, a book, a chapel, a flame, a vibration, always just beyond reach, perpetually shifting. But for those who have traversed the hidden paths, Templar, Cathar, mystic, monk, it is consistently the same entity, not an object, but a profound threshold. The Grail is frequently portrayed as a questa journey, a pursuit across war-torn landscapes and myth-soaked forests in search of a shining, holy artifact. However, embedded within that quest, often overlooked or politely disregarded, is a man-broken, waiting, observing the decay of the land around him. He is the Fisher King, and his presence in Grail lore is not a mere afterthought that represents the profound consequence. According to the medieval romances, the Fisher King serves as the guardian of the Grail, or more accurately, its prisoner. He has sustained a wound, frequently in the thigh, sometimes ambiguously described as a groin injury. He is unable to perish, yet he cannot heal. He resides within a castle that intermittently materializes and fades from reality. Around him, the land wastes away, rivers desiccate, trees perish, children suffer from hunger. The wasteland expands, mirroring his affliction, and only the precise inquiry, the true question, possesses the power to break this enchantment. This is not a narrative intended to offer solace. It is a dire warning, meticulously encoded within myth. There is something inherently Templar about the Fisher King, a sacred guardian who endures silent suffering, a custodian of a power. He cannot harness a relic that heals, yet he remains unhealed. And perhaps most significantly, a world that reflects his condition, broken not by conflict, but by profound forgetfulness. Some scholars contend that the Fisher King represents a Christianized vestige of older pagan archetypes, the wounded god, the sacred king, whose well-being dictates the land's fertility. This concept appears in Celtic, Egyptian, and even Mesopotamian traditions. However, when filtered through the Grail mythos, it acquires new significance. The king is not wounded by adversaries, he is wounded by knowledge, or worse, by direct contact. One version of the tale, Dido Percival, hints that the king was once whole, but after gazing directly upon the Grail, he was afflicted by a wound of knowing, a phrase so surreal, so mythically charged, that it is often glossed over. Yet, consider its implications that the Grail, far from being a healing object, inflicted a form of permanent fracture that, comprehending too much, too soon, without proper preparation, can shatter the soul. One might recall the earlier theory that the Grail does not merely transform, but judges that it recognizes a specific quality in the bearer frequency, a state of readiness. When that resonance is incomplete, the effect is not death, but a profound stasis. The Fisher King does not perish in battle, he lingers. Time itself warps around him. The land directly reflects his injury. Some esoteric texts, particularly those associated with later Rosicrucian thought, speculate that the Grail's presence generates a psychic field, that its activation influences not just the individual, but the very environment, that if misaligned, its frequency induces a spiritual inversion, transforming blessings into burdens. In this model, the wasteland is not cursed, it is fundamentally disconnected. Reality is disrupted by an improperly harmonized relic. The relic itself still functions, it is the wielder who is broken. Now, reimagine the Fisher King as a Templar figure, a guardian who once sought awakening and discovered only paralysis. There are whispers, unproven but persistent, that a high-ranking Templar, possibly a preceptor stationed in Aragon, spent the final years of his life in absolute isolation. He refused communion. He conversed exclusively with birds. His room was discovered meticulously lined with geometric patterns carved obsessively into the stone walls. He was known as the Silent Light. Some assert he had touched something beneath the Temple Mount and could no longer endure human interaction. Whether fact or folklore, the parallels with the Fisher King are chilling. In Perlisvaus, a more esoteric Grail narrative, the king states, "I held the vessel, and it saw through me." This inversion not he saw it, but it saw him recurs across multiple traditions. In Ethiopian lore, the Ark is said to gaze into the soul. In certain Gnostic rituals, the initiate stands before the mirror of flame to be judged. The implication is consistently the same: one does not merely find the relic, it finds you, and it leaves an indelible mark. Some believe the Fisher King is not a literal person, but a metaphor for the earth itself. That when humanity diverted from the inner path, the Grail path, the world began to decline. Climate collapse, perpetual warfare, spiritual emptiness, this constitutes the wasteland. The Grail, then, becomes a forgotten technology, not of metal or code, but of consciousness, something interred not in caves, but within humanity itself. The king's wound is intrinsically our own, which brings us to the pivotal question in the Grail romances. The hero must pose the correct question to heal the king. Not to vanquish a dragon, not to solve an enigma, simply to ask. However, the question remains perpetually elusive. In some versions, it is, "Whom does the Grail serve?" In others, "What ails you?" Yet, the precise wording is less significant than the underlying intention. The seeker must genuinely perceive the wounded king, not as a test, but as an individual, requiring compassion. Compassion, in essence, is the key. This mirrors the Cathar and Gnostic insistence that awakening is not solely knowledge, but also love. The divine light necessitates empathy to truly shine. The Grail does not respond to cleverness, it responds to genuine care. And until that care is demonstrated, the wound persists. The relic remains silent. The world continues to forget. So, here we are. Perhaps the Fisher King still lives, not in a medieval castle, but within every seeker who has glimpsed truth and discovered only silence. Perhaps the Grail remains present, not as a definitive cure, but as an enduring challenge, patiently awaiting the question we are too afraid to ask. And perhaps the wasteland is not a geographical location, it is a profound mirror. It was a morning indistinguishable from any other in Paris. Cold, still, the kind of morning that offers no prescient warning that an empire is about to crumble. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would forever imbue superstition with a chilling resonance, King Philip IV of France, acting with the purported blessing of Pope Clement V, ordered the simultaneous arrest of the Knights Templar. Hundreds were seized, their assets summarily frozen, and their vast lands confiscated. The most powerful and enigmatic military order in Christendom was obliterated with a single stroke of quill and seal. Officially, the charges levied against them were heresy, idolatry, and corruption. They were accused of desecrating crosses, worshipping peculiar heads, and engaging in forbidden rituals. However, even at that time, many recognized the charges as a deliberate fabrication. The Templars' true transgression was not blasphemite, was their possession of something the king could not control. They had become excessively powerful, excessively wealthy. Their sophisticated banking system rivaled that of the crown. Their clandestine secrets profoundly unnerved the papacy. And most unsettling of all, whispers circulated that they possessed something other a relic, a potent force, an entity that glowed in the dark, both metaphorically and, perhaps, literally. Philip was far from a simpleton. He was financially destitute, desperate, and dangerously cunning. By systematically eliminating the Templars, he could simultaneously cancel his immense debts and seize their vast wealth. However, Pope Clement's motivations are considerably murkier. Some suggest he was coerced. Others contend he had long harbored suspicions that the order safeguarded heretical teachings. Yet, buried within the Vatican's secret Archive Sand, partially leaked through the 2001 publication of the Chinon Parchmentlies, an inconvenient truth, the Pope had already privately absolved the Templars prior to their public condemnation. He was fully aware that the charges were fallacious, and yet he permitted the suppression to proceed. Why? Because even if the Templars were not outright heretics, they represented a profound danger, not militarily, but spiritually. They had witnessed something, perhaps beneath Jerusalem, perhaps in the vaults of Ethiopia, perhaps in the profound silence of their own ceremonies, and they no longer submitted to Rome's authority with the same unquestioning obedience. They communicated in riddles. They constructed churches with seemingly impossible geometry. They initiated new members through rituals that made bishops profoundly uneasy. They were no longer predictable, and when the church is unable to explain an entity, it proceeds to eliminate it. However, here is the crucial element that history frequently omits. The Grail, if the Templars possessed it, was never discovered. Dozens of Templar commanderies were meticulously ransacked. Vaults were forcefully opened, monasteries were subjected to immolation. Yet, no Grail, no peculiar head, no luminous artifact, no idol of Baphomet was ever found. Nothing tangible emerged that could justify the widespread panic. It was not merely an absence, it was an absence with a discernible precision, as if they had been forewarned. Some believe the betrayal was not unforeseen. Years earlier, the Templars' inner circle had reportedly sensed the impending threat, and a meticulous plan was already in motion to relocate the relic, or at least its active component, beyond the reach of both king and pope. Theories range from secret tunnels beneath Paris to ships setting sail for Scotland, Portugal, or even the New World. However, the truth may be more fundamental. The Grail was never intended to remain stationary. What resonates in hindsight is the sheer public nature of the betrayal. Templars were apprehended during morning prayers, forcibly removed from their beds, forbidden from communicating with one another, interrogated, tortured, and ultimately broken. Yet, many remained silent. One prisoner reportedly muttered during his inquest, "You seek the cup, but you will never drink." Another, more cryptically, declared, "The true vessel cannot be seized, it is already inside." The betrayal extended beyond individual merit, encompassed memory, meaning. The Church needed to reassert absolute control over the narrative. The Grail, once a perilous relic of profound transformation, had to be diminished, mythologized, reconfigured into a poetic symbol for faith, love, or the Eucharist. This approach was considerably safer. One might recall how earlier legends began to shift around this period. The Grail became less radiant, less actively powerful. It no longer blinded, it healed. It served kings. It awaited discovery in castles. It was beautiful, yes, but no longer disruptive. The Church meticulously reshaped the narrative in its own image. Christ died. The Grail collected his blood, and all was subsequently well. Transformation gave way to nostalgia. However, something fundamental failed to take hold. In the shadows, the other Grail persisted, the one that judged, the one that demanded readiness, the one the Templars had protected not out of conventional holiness, but because it was perceived as a living entity. And then came Jacques de Molay, the final Grand Master. After 7 grueling years of imprisonment, of enforced silence, of being manipulated as a pawn in a theological puppet show, he was burned alive on the Ile de la Cité in 1314. Witnesses recount that he remained remarkably composed, gazing directly at the representatives of the king and the pope, and that his final words were not curses, but a promise of reckoning. He is reported to have declared, "The truth shall not stay buried, the light will return." Some interpret this as a general prophecy, a plea for divine justice. Others believe he spoke directly of the relic, that even as the flames consumed him, the Grail remained hidden, guarded, humming quietly in exile, perhaps beneath a chapel, perhaps within a specific lineage, perhaps not in a geographical location at all, but as a condition, a state of profound readiness. There exists one final twist just prior to his execution. According to an obscure chronicle by a Genoese merchant, de Molay requested water. They provided him with a wooden cup. He held it briefly, gazed into it, and then smiled. Some consider this an act of profound irony. Others ponder if he simply remembered. The flames licked at the periphery of his robe, as if sampling something ancient, something forbidden. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood bound to the stake in the shadow of Notre Dame, displaying not trembling knees or tearful supplications, but an expression of serenity that profoundly unsettled the observing multitude. Fire was intended to purify, to punish, to obliterate. Yet, de Molay did not scream. He simply observed. He waited. And then he spoke. His final words, recorded in various chronicles with differing degrees of precision, have been subjected to myriad interpretations. Some accounts state he cursed the king and the pope, summoning them to meet him before divine judgment. Others assert he uttered nothing at all. However, in a lesser-known account, preserved in a private family archive in Brittany and largely disregarded by mainstream historians, he pronounced something far stranger, not a curse, not a threat. The light cannot be quenched. It remembers its own. The phrasing is peculiar, neither biblical nor legalistic, but rather something else, something more aligned with the tone of the mystic, the alchemist, the guardian. To those who have meticulously studied the deeper legends of the Grail, it resonates like a tuning fork, the light, the remembrance, the refusal to succumb to oblivion. Consider this: de Molay had endured 7 years of captivity, subjected to torture, starvation, and relentless interrogation, forbidden from communicating with his brethren. He possessed every conceivable reason to confess, to bargain, to curse his adversaries. Yet, he maintained an unwavering silence until the very end. What then was he safeguarding? Or perhaps, more accurately, what signal was he transmitting? Among esoteric historians, a theory persists that de Molay's execution transcended mere political retribution. It was a ritual, that both the church and the crown believed, or feared, that his death might precipitate a release or a significant shift, that something intrinsic to him, something learned, carried, or inherited, had to be entirely extinguished, not for justice, but for profound containment. This theory hinges on 2 lesser-known events. First, the night prior to his execution, de Molay reportedly requested a final vigil, not for prayer, but for absolute silence. The guards noted that he sat upright for hours in his cell, unmoving, eyes closed. A monk assigned to hear his final confession reported that de Molay radiated heat, even in the cold stone room, not metaphorical heat, but physical. The monk instinctively withdrew his hand from de Molay's shoulder, as if seared. Second, the stake upon which he was executed reportedly burned with unnatural speed. Eyewitnesses noted that the flames ascended with unusual rapidity, consuming the platform within minutes. One chronicler described a sudden gust of wind, yet others reported no wind whatsoever. Amidst the inferno, de Molay remained motionless. It was not until the wooden structure collapsed beneath him that his body disappeared into the pyre. All of this might be dismissed as dramatized folklore, were it not for an artifact discovered decades later. In 1789, amidst the tumultuous chaos of the French Revolution, rebels ransacking a church in rural Normandy unearthed a wooden box sealed with a wax emblem, the Templar cross. Inside, meticulously wrapped in deteriorated linen, was a scorched wooden cup. It bore no inscriptions, no jewels, merely a plain vessel, blackened by heat and faintly luminous in certain light. Most initially dismissed it as a devotional object, a mere keepsake. However, one detail proved remarkable. The box contained a scrap of parchment, barely legible, that read, "This held the flame, not the wine." It remembered him, and he it. No further explanation was provided. The cup ultimately disappeared into private hands, sold at auction under the vague title Templar chalice. Yet, photographs taken in 1910 reveal something peculiar. A faint residue along the inside rim, crystalline in nature, invisible under normal light, but conspicuously glowing under ultraviolet exposure. Attempts at analysis proved inconclusive. The object vanished again shortly thereafter. Thus, the notion persists that de Molay did not approach the stake empty-handed. That, in his final moments, he carried something, perhaps not the Grail itself, but a fragment, a shard, or a key. One version of the tale suggests he pressed his palm to the cup moments before the flames reached him, whispering not to the crowd but to the relic, and that the subsequent glow was not mere firelight, but a profound response. One might recall the earlier concept that the Grail is selective, that it recognizes lineage, frequency, or readiness. If de Molay had attained such a state after years of silence, meditation, and rigorous purification, it is plausible that he entered that profound threshold not of physical immortality, but of transfiguration that the flames did not destroy, but rather revealed. A final clue resides in the writings of a young novice from Avignon, who claimed to have experienced a vision on the night of de Molay's death. In this vision, she perceived a figure standing in a hall of stars, holding a bowl of light. When she inquired about his identity, he responded, "I am not the guardian, I am the memory. The Grail, it seems, does not burn." The Church branded this account as hysteria. The rest of us may recognize it as continuity. For if de Molay's ultimate act was a communion, not with the Church, but with the relic, then his execution was not an ending. It was a transfer not of possession, but of resonance. The Grail, after all, belongs to no one. It aligns, it remembers, it waits. And if his final words held truth, then it still waits not in Paris, not in a tomb, but somewhere tranquil, somewhere undisturbed, holding the memory of a knight who confronted fire with silence and vanished into profound light. The fortress of Montségur, dramatically perched high in the Pyrenees, represents more than mere stone. It is silence rendered architectural, a place where the wind carries ancient secrets and every shadow feels as though it observes you. It was here, in 1244, that the final resolute stand of the Cathars reached its tragic conclusion. After months of relentless siege, as the pyres were stoked and over 200 heretics prepared to meet their demise in the flames, something clandestinely slipped through the cracks. Or more precisely, 4 distinct somethings. This narrative has endured not through official chronicles or formal records, but through persistent whispers. According to local oral tradition, quietly transmitted through Occitan villages and shepherd families, 4 Cathars managed to escape Montségur on the eve of the final purge. They descended the perilous cliffs under the cloak of darkness, carrying with them an entity termed le trésor, the treasure of the Church. However, no gold was ever subsequently recovered, no manuscripts, no jewels. This leads to the unyielding question, what precisely constituted this treasure? Many believe it was the Grail, or at least a significant component of it. At that historical juncture, Montségur functioned as more than a mere fortress. It was a spiritual sanctuary, a pivotal center for Cathar initiation. Pilgrims arrived not for physical protection, but for profound spiritual transfiguration. Rumors, too persistent to be dismissed, circulated that the Cathars possessed something ancient, something luminous, though not in a conventional sense. It was never displayed. Its existence was not openly discussed. Yet, it was undeniably present. A French folklorist, writing in the 1890 seconds, meticulously recorded an interview with a shepherd whose family had resided near Montségur for generations. The elderly man claimed that his ancestor witnessed 4 figures moving silently across the ridgeline on the night preceding the fires. They carried nothing, he stated, but the air around them shimmered. While this could understandably be dismissed as a mere ghost story, local legends are rarely born from absolute fabrication. A more substantial clue lies within the architectural design of the fortress itself. Recent studies have demonstrated that Montségur was constructed with remarkable astronomical precision. Its main hall was perfectly aligned with the rising sun at the spring equinox. This alignment mirrors that of certain Egyptian temples and, intriguingly, several Templar chapels in Portugal. The implication here is that Montségur was not merely a refuge, it was a sophisticated container, a vessel of stone meticulously built to harmonize with celestial cycles, much like the Grail itself. Some theorize that the relic, whatever its nature, had to be removed before the fortress succumbed. It could not be permitted to fall into inquisitorial hands, not because of its intrinsic material value, but because of its active, potentially dangerous properties. The fires that consumed the Cathars were not solely executions, they served as strategic smoke screens, diverting global attention from the fact that the most crucial object within the fortress had already departed. And here is where the trail bifurcates. One theory posits that the 4 escapees fled to Aragon and subsequently sought protection within Templar commanderies along the Spanish frontier. This would be a logical course of action, given the strong Templar presence in the region and their known practice of sheltering other persecuted groups. There even exists a document, preserved in a Cistercian archive, that refers to the sudden arrival of 4 silent pilgrims at a monastery just weeks after Montségur's fall. Another theory, more speculative, suggests they transported the relic to a cave high in the Pyrenees, a location so remote and treacherous that it has remained undiscovered since. The area is rife with legends of the Singing Stone, a cavern purported to emit sound when approached by the faithful. Geologists have largely dismissed these claims, attributing the phenomena to underground airflow. However, this scientific explanation fails to account for reports that the sound reportedly changes depending on the individual entering the cave. One might recall from earlier discussions the notion that the Grail is not static, that it actively responds. Perhaps this cave, if it truly exists, was chosen not merely as a hiding place, but as an interface, a location specifically tuned to the relic's unique frequency, a stone cradle. One final possibility is perhaps the most outlandish, yet simultaneously the most compelling. Some believe the treasure was not the Grail itself, but a persona living vessel, perhaps a child of a sacred bloodline, or an initiate who had fully merged with the relic's inherent power. If this premise holds true, then the escape from Montagut was not about smuggling gold or scrolls, but about preserving memory within living flesh. Fragments exist to support this interpretation. A 13th century Occitan hymn refers to the vessel that walks, and a later Cathar prophecy, recorded by a Dominican spy, speaks of the light carried not in hand but in heart. These phrases, cryptic as they are, align eerily with the Gnostic and Templar belief that the Grail could manifest as a human being, that it is not merely something one discovers, but something one ultimately becomes. This would explain the Church's obsessive efforts to eradicate not only the Cathars, but also their genealogies. Inquisition records demonstrate that entire families were meticulously tracked for generations after Montagut. Children were relocated, names altered. If the relic had become embodied, the only effective means of silencing it was through lineage eradication. Yet, the narrative never completely disappears. In a small church within the Languedoc, there is a stained glass window that has puzzled scholars for decades. It depicts no crucifixion, no saints, only 4 figures ascending a mountain trail, bathed in golden rays. One carries a bowl, one a book, one nothing, and the last figure glows. No inscription, no explanation, only color and profound silence. Montagut is now a ruin, yet the mountain continues to hum. Tourists ascend, cameras in hand, unaware that they are treading upon the ashes of something never truly extinguished. The wind at that elevation possesses a palpable edge. The stone underfoot feels older than recorded time. And perhaps, just perhaps, something indeed escaped. Not lost, merely waiting. One traverses the excavation site with the wind whispering more audibly than the voices of the living. All around, archaeologists meticulously crouch with brushes and instruments, coaxing narratives from the earth. However, a distinct difference pervades this location. The silence is unusually heavy. The air does not merely carry dust, it appears to exert a subtle resistance, as if the very ground resents being disturbed. This phenomenon was reported by a team working beneath the ruins of a former Templar preceptory in southern France, an unassuming field that transmuted into an enigma. They initially sought coins, walls, bones. What they discovered instead was nothing, or rather, an absence that appeared profoundly deliberate. Rooms exhibiting excessive symmetry, chambers sealed using techniques seemingly beyond their historical period. And in one particular room, the lowest and deepest, there were no bones, no artifacts, only a perfectly circular burn mark on the stone, and most peculiar of all, an area where electronic equipment consistently malfunctioned. Recorders reverted to static, lenses fogged over. Even cellular phones refused to power on. They attempted to resume their work with analog tools, sketchpads, manual logs. However, several team members soon began reporting headaches, nausea, and disorientation. One, a woman with no pre-existing health issues, completely collapsed and was unable to recall her name for 3 days. Medical explanations were naturally offered: heat stroke, poor air quality, fungal spores. Yet, upon the team's departure from the site, their symptoms vanished. This was not an isolated incident. Across Europe, in at least 4 other confirmed Templar sites, from Portugal to the Balkans, Similar phenomena have been quietly documented. At one location near Tamar, Portugal, excavators reported unmarked cavities emitting brief flashes of blue light. At another in northern Italy, a stone sarcophagus was uncovered, only for the lead archaeologist to reseal it without providing explanation. He subsequently resigned and refused to speak to the press. These accounts are rarely published, not due to a lack of intrigue, but because they reside outside the parameters of what academic journals dare to print. However, in the margins of field notes, in the whispered conversations between colleagues, a consistent phrase emerges: "Something is wrong down there." And one phrase recurs more frequently than others: "La reliquifie vivianite," the living relic. This brings to mind an earlier concept: if the Grail is not merely a tangible object, but an interface or a palpable presence, then perhaps the disturbance lies not within the stone, but within the interaction itself, something dormant until noticed, until disturbed. One particularly unusual account originates from a small team of independent researchers who ventured into a Templar outpost in modern-day Serbia. Their objective was to document carvings reported by local inhabitants. They approached with skepticism, equipped only with notebooks, cameras, and minimal stimulants. They anticipated nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, upon entering a sealed chamber, they reported a high-frequency hum, too elevated for most human ears, and a sensation described as having their thoughts echoed before you think them. None of their audio recordings captured the hum. Their photographs were blurred. Nevertheless, the team departed profoundly shaken. Two members subsequently abandoned archaeology entirely. One wrote cryptically that she had touched something older than memory and more aware than stone. Skeptics dismiss this as folklore disguised in modern attire. They argue that the pervasive power of Templar myth contaminates the mind, that hallucinations, preconceived expectations, and suggestion are to blame. And, in fairness, their argument possesses merit. A shovel remains merely a shovel until someone asserts it is unearthing eternity. However, the pattern is too consistent, too specific, and too unsettling. Even some church records acknowledge peculiar occurrences. One Vatican archivist, who later departed his post under suspicious circumstances, leaked a redacted inventory of items of concerning nature. Among the entries, most barely legible, one stood out: object recovered from Inquisition crypt, unresponsive to sanctified ritual, emits unknown light at 31-second intervals. Cause of death unexplained. No date, no location, just a singular directive: do not unseal. This brings us back to a concept hinted at by the Cathars, that the Grail, if real, may have been not only active, but sentient, an entity that chooses, an entity that refuses. Perhaps this is why the Templars guarded it with such fierce dedication, not because they owned it, but because they were endeavoring to contain it. Yet, they never referred to it by name. Even in their private journals, even in codes and riddles, the relic is consistently referred to with euphemisms: the light that sleeps, the flame beyond bone, the mirror of becoming, names that initially sound poetic, until one comprehends that poetry is often employed when one is too apprehensive to speak plainly. In one fragment of Templar writing, deciphered only within the last decade, a passage reads, "That which we buried will not forget. We blindfold the novice, not for his safety, but for the relics." Ponder this implication. What type of object necessitates protection from the observer? One might recall how earlier Grail accounts mentioned blindness not symbolic, but literal light that sears, visions too sharp for the mind to fully grasp. If this holds true, then these excavation narratives begin to cohere. The dizziness, the nausea, the vanishing time, these are not mere side effects, they are inherent defenses, warnings. Naturally, it is easy to laugh, to dismiss such accounts. Archaeology is inherently characterized by dust and coincidences. However, coincidences do not typically align across languages, nations, and centuries, with symptoms that rhyme like verses in a forgotten song. Perhaps the pertinent question is not why the Grail has not been found, but rather what occurs when it actively resists discovery. And, more unsettlingly, What happens when it chooses to reveal itself? For something is stirring beneath the ruins, and not all relics slumber quietly. One pauses for a moment in that familiar corridor of polished stone and pervasive incense. The air is thick, redolent of the imagined halls beneath the Vatican. Dim light filters through narrow slits in the walls, more symbolic than functional, casting elongated shadows like grasping fingers. Behind one of those sealed doors, rumor suggests, lies an inventory not intended for human eyes, not lost, not forgotten, simply hidden, labeled, shelved, and left undisturbed. It begins, as most disquieting truths often do, with a whisper. In 1902, a former Vatican archivist, known to scholars only by his pseudonym Clementus, released a peculiar document to a journalist in Germany. It was a photograph of a handwritten inventory, dated 1774, bearing the title Res Extra Can Omen Things Outside the Canon. These were not heresies, not banned books, but objects, tangible entities that, according to the marginalia, had been secured during the Templar suppression. This in itself was not groundbreaking news. The Vatican has long acknowledged possessing various relics, bones, robes, thorns, crosses, chalices, all meticulously preserved under varying degrees of reverence or suspicion. However, this particular list was different. It included items described in ways that provoked both intense curiosity and trepidation: an unfading light, an iron lattice, an orb of fluid fire, and most tantalizingly, a vessel of fleshless communion. Not a cup, not a stone, a vessel that, according to the notes, rejects duplication. Clemens himself vanished a few weeks after the document's release. The journalist who received it claimed their home was subsequently broken into, but only the photocopy was taken. The original reportedly remained with the church, or perhaps it never genuinely left. And here is where matters transition from mere legend to a discernible pattern. Throughout the 20th century, scattered reports from former insiders, cardinals, Swiss guards, archivists, all subsequently silenced or discredited, described a vault beneath the apostolic palace. This vault had no official designation, but was informally referred to as Ardor Mens, is the sleeping ark. It was reputedly a chamber sealed not merely by locks and guards, but by intricate rites. Access was restricted, requiring 3 keys never held by the same individual. The objects contained within were said to include the Veil of Veronica, certain scrolls never publicly released after the Dead Sea discoveries, and something called the Flame Without Fuel. This last item, according to one informant, had reportedly not dimmed in centuries, although it was maintained under 5 layers of lead, perpetually surrounded by prayers. What kind of relic necessitates containment through prayer? A detail from an earlier chapter resurfaces the quote about a relic emitting light at fixed intervals. It mirrors these more recent claims. A disconcerting consistency across centuries and whispers never intended to converge. There is more. A former Swiss guard, discharged in 2003 for mental instability, later authored an anonymous memoir that was swiftly removed from publication. In it, he described a night patrol near the 4th sub-level of the archives, where he claimed to witness an object like a mirror made of embers. He stated its presence induced vertigo. His companion collapsed. No alarm was sounded, no record officially filed. The following day, the hallway had been freshly repainted. The church's official stance is, naturally, outright denial. The Vatican Museum houses relics. The secret archives contain records. The purported inventory is deemed a fabrication, the testimonies misremembered, delusional, and at times even demonically inspired. Yet, a peculiar pattern emerges in papal conclaves. Each time a new pope is elected, there follows a day, sometimes 2, of complete silence after the emission of white smoke. No public appearances, no mass, simply profound stillness. The official rationale is meditation, prayer, or the overwhelming shock of the moment. However, according to leaked schedules, one of the very first actions of any newly elected pope is a private descent into the vaults to view the inventory to comprehend what the Church truly safeguards. Not everything is strictly doctrinal. Some objects are older, untamed, and not every pope emerges from this encounter unchanged. In 1964, Pope Paul VI reportedly ordered the sealing of a chamber, never marked on maps, following his audience with a group of scientists investigating peculiar manuscripts linked to Qumran. The meeting was discreet, but afterward, several theologians close to him reported a sharp shift in his temper, a mentor sudden, consuming interest in spiritual containment. Not evangelism, not expansion, but simply holding the line. Holding what? Precisely. We now return to the Templars, to what they might have uncovered in Jerusalem or elsewhere. If they did discover a relic that promised immortality, or at least profound transformation, their immediate action would have been to meticulously conceal it. Their second action to record it, to encode it, to protect it with oaths and the threat of death. However, after the Templars were suppressed, the Church had decades to systematically ransack their archives, interrogate survivors, intercept couriers, and quite literally excavate what had been interred. What if they succeeded? What if they found it? And what if, instead of destroying it, they sealed it away? Perhaps not out of fear, perhaps not even out of reverence, but simply because they were uncertain of any other course of action. One account suggests a meeting in 1811 between a Jesuit mystic and Pope Pius VII, wherein the mystic claimed the relic was not meant to be understood, only to be kept asleep. That phrase, "again sleep," as if the true danger was not that the Grail was alive, but that it might awaken, and so they locked it away. Not under glass like a museum exhibit, not behind velvet ropes, but behind a pervasive doctrine of silence, buried so profoundly in ritual and secrecy that even those entrusted with its protection no longer fully comprehend what they are guarding. A relic that cannot be touched, cannot be replicated, cannot be definitively denied. It remains, perhaps, now in that nameless chamber, humming gently against the lead, listening, waiting. For even the Vatican, despite all its walls and secrets, cannot unmake that which was once discovered. And when the world inevitably shifts, it may determine that it no longer desires to slumber. One recalls the whispers, this time not concerning an object, but a person. Not a relic sealed beneath stone, but a corporeal entity traversing the world, perhaps oblivious, or keenly aware, and meticulously hidden. For every theory that posits the Grail as a physical artifact, another adamantly insists it was never intended to be physically held at all. It was meant to be borne, carried not within a chalice, but within specific blood. This is where our investigation narrows to its most extraordinary claim that the Grail was not merely a sacred mechanism or a vessel of divine energy, but something that necessitated a highly specific spark for activation genetic ignition, a particular bloodline. Templar records are notoriously cryptic. However, among the preserved writings from the Chinon parchments, the few that survived fire, time, and Rome are anomalous references to Sanguis Lucans, the shining blood. Some scholars dismiss this phrase as metaphorical, symbolizing purity, sacrifice, or divine favor. Yet, the Templars did not employ metaphors idly. When they encoded information, they often intended it literally, wrapped within just enough allegory to ensure its security. In 1351, a heretical monk named Renaud d'Avion was executed after asserting he had witnessed the Grail awakened. His confession, transcribed under duress but corroborated by 3 witnesses, described a ritual in which a child of unknown lineage was positioned beside a relic one concealed under crystal, maintained in darkness, and guarded by swords. The relic reportedly responded not with light, but with vibrational hum akin to wind beneath the earth. The boy reportedly bled from his palms, yet emitted no cry, and then the vault was resealed. This would be mere myth were it not echoed centuries later in the peculiar obsession of certain secret societies with genealogy. The Priory of Sion, the Rex Deus group, Even fragments of Masonic lore point toward a living Kea term employed not in reference to wisdom or initiation, but to a physical individual, someone whose ancestry unlocks something beyond mere metaphor. During Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, one of his occult advisors reportedly discovered a partially translated Coptic scroll that described the vessel that knows its master. This vessel, according to the scribe, would remain inert to the unchosen, but would sing in silence when touched by one of the branch. The scroll was subsequently lost in the turmoil of Alexandria, but the phrase endured in notes by Dominique Vivant Denon, one of Napoleon's artists and a collector of heretical relics. Why this pervasive obsession with lineage? Perhaps a more pertinent question is, whose lineage? Here, the theories converge with the most explosive of all Christian conspiracies, that Christ had descendants, that the bloodline persisted, that Mary Magdalene was not merely a follower, but a wife, and their child escaped, concealed by those who would form the foundational elements of the Grail cults, the Merovingians, the Cathars, the exiled Templars. One recalls the Cathar fortress of Montagut and the narrative of the four who escaped with the treasure. Some claim it was scrolls, others believe it was a relic. However, among the oldest Occitan songs passed down from that region is a lullaby, sweet and haunting, which concludes with the line, "And in the child the cup did shine." These are peculiar words for a bedtime tune. In 1891, a French priest named Berenguer Saunier made a significant discovery beneath the altar of his remote church in Rennes-le-Château. He subsequently became suddenly wealthy, unaccountably so. More than that, he grew paranoid, obsessively preoccupied with bloodlines. He extensively revised the Stations of the Cross in his chapel, incorporating unusual figures, symbols of resurrection, and what some assert is a concealed portrait of a woman holding a baby while standing upon a serpent. Later, scholars uncovered evidence that he had been corresponding with members of the Habsburg family regarding custodianship. Custodianship of what, precisely, remains ambiguous. Fast forward to a secret meeting in Portugal in 1943. A Templar offshoot, operating under Masonic cover, purportedly conducted a ritual involving a young man descended from Spanish nobility. Witnesses reported that he was given a smooth, silver-veined stone, and it grew warm in his hand. Again, this is anecdotal, again unverifiable, but the pattern persists. We now revisit the Templars' rumored belief that Christ's power was not solely divine, it was transmissible, not through teachings alone, but through flesh and blood. The Grail, in this view, was not merely a container for divine presence. It was a receiver, a dormant mechanism that only awakens when it senses the correct frequency, and that frequency resides not in stone, not in code, but in DNA. This theory is inherently too volatile for mainstream historians. It implies not only that the Templars discovered the Grail, but also that they found or meticulously preserved the lineage that someone alive today might still carry it. Some have claimed it points towards a discreet, noble family in southern France. Others suggest it departed Europe entirely, carried by Templar ships after the Purge, intermarried into distant royal lines, or concealed among peasants. Certain hypotheses point towards the Ethiopian royals. A few even whisper about a genetic line preserved through the Kashan Jews of Iran. These are wild, intricate theories, each possessing fragments of documentation, yet none with definitive proof, or at least none that anyone has been permitted to examine. There even exists a Vatican prophecy, apocryphal and never officially acknowledged, which predicts that the blood will return to the vault before the final trumpet cryptic. Ominous, perhaps baseless, perhaps not. One reflects upon all the relics pursued in this narrative: fragments of bone, luminous stones, scrolls burned or buried, secret chambers, and sealed vaults. Yet, what if the most precious component of the Grail has been walking among us all along, unknowing, untapped, waiting? If the Grail was designed or created to resonate with only one specific bloodline, then the secret the Templars protected was not the object itself. It was the person, And if that person still lives, the Grail, wherever it resides, is not lost. It is simply dormant, listening, patiently awaiting the sound of a forgotten voice, transmitted through generations' frequency only one heart can produce. The ultimate key to immortality may not be steel or stone. It may be intrinsic to human existence. Now, all the constituent pieces lie before us, akin to fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a distinct facet of a mystery too expansive to comprehend in a single glance. The cup that was not a cup, the flame that burned without producing heat, the relic that moved, sang, or shimmered only when touched by a specific blood, narratives of light, of voices, of vibrations within stone, whispers of a vessel, of a presence, of a gateway between what is mortal and what may transcend mortality. We have followed this intricate trail across burned manuscripts, coded chapels, and persecuted cults. We have traversed the shadowy vaults of Solomon, stood beside silent sarcophagi in Montaigut, and listened to deathbed confessions articulated in forgotten tongues. Each step subtly reiterated the same fundamental premise. The Grail was never simple. It was not singular. It was not mundane. At last, the theory emerges that sends a chill down the spine, even when whispered not because it is blasphemous or absurd, but because it aligns with disturbing precision. The Grail was not merely an object. It was a system, a profound confluence of three interconnected elements: sacred device, a specific bloodline, and a state of spiritual readiness that few could genuinely attain. Individually, each element remained inert. Collectively, they generated something that transcended the conventional limits of death, not merely metaphorically, but biologically, mystically, and perhaps even technologically. Let us commence with the concept of a sacred device, not a mere cup, but a meticulously constructed object. Perhaps crystalline, perhaps metallic, conceivably even organic. The historical descriptions vary wildly. Some portray it as pulsing like a heart. Others refer to it as a stone that sang. A few describe it as a mirror, or even as an orb, that grew warm in the presence of certain individuals. In Ethiopian tradition, the relic accompanying the ark is said to emit a low hum, not symbolic, but demonstrably real, potentially measurable with modern instrumentation. One archaeologist claimed his Geiger counter registered a significant spike when brought near a specific chamber beneath Lake Tana. Radiation, yes, but of what precise nature? No further investigation ensued. The area was subsequently sealed. Then, the bloodline, the so-called living key. Not merely any descendant, but one whose genetic code somehow interacts with the relic. Wildly speculative, certainly, until one recalls what Templar texts described as the Sengir's loose light-bearing blood. They were actively searching for something, or someone, capable of awakening the relic. Rituals were not solely prayers, they were activations. The Grail was not merely a symbol of faith, it functioned as a biometric lock. And the final component, consciousness. This is the elusive element, the one that escapes easy grasp. Even possessing the relic and the correct bloodline would be meaningless without the requisite inner spark. Gnostic texts affirm that the Grail awakens only in those who are no longer spiritually asleep. Cathar teachings maintained that the treasure would blind the unprepared. Templar alchemists discoursed upon transfiguration, the transformation of the soul not into gold, but into an entity less tethered to corporeal flesh. It was not merely about achieving eternal life. It was about attaining transcendence, awakening into what early Christians might have termed thesis, divinization, becoming elevated entirely beyond the constraints of death. Synthesizing all three elements, the Grail ceases to be a static object and transforms into a technology ancient, sacred, and profoundly dangerous, a divine mechanism designed not to grant wishes, but to unlock a profound portal. Now, recall Rosslyn Chapel. Remember how its ceiling purportedly mimics the vibrations of sacred sound. Consider the pillars carved in a double helix form. the hundreds of carvings suggesting a harmonic code, not merely artistic, but instructional. What if the chapel was not constructed to venerate the Grail, but to replicate its frequency, a receiver, or perhaps a warning beacon? The Templars did not merely conceal the Grail, they fragmented it. They dispersed the knowledge across time, language, and geographical locations. One part was encoded in stone, another in blood, another interred within scrolls written in dead languages and consumed by holy fire. They were not merely preserving a relic, they were diligently protecting a blueprint, and they harbored a profound apprehension regarding the consequences should the wrong individual reassemble it. Some believed the Grail had been activated once, perhaps twice. Each instance reportedly left echoes, strange lights, seismic activity, entire monasteries falling into profound silence. One theory even links the Black Death to a failed Grail ritual in Avignon. Preposterous, perhaps. Yet, the Pope, who relocated to Avignon, did so after an unnamed Templar priest delivered a sealed box to him with the strict injunction that it must never be opened. What if the Vatican's vaults contain not merely relics, but components of the device? What if the object of flame mentioned in those forbidden inventories is part of a mechanism not mystical, but magnetic, not divine, but engineered? And who engineered it? Here, one delves into deeper shadows. Some whisper the Grail predates Christ, that it is a relic from the antediluvian world, the same epoch hinted at in the Book of Enoch, in Sumerian myths, in the legends of the Nephilim. Perhaps the Grail was not crafted by human hands at all, but left behind, subsequently discovered, and profoundly misunderstood. The Templars may have been the last to possess it, but certainly not the first, and perhaps not the only ones who continue to seek it. One perceives it now, does one not? The pervasive dread of a mystery that does not culminate in definitive answers, but instead commences with them. If the Grail was indeed a system, and if its components have been scattered across centuries, then someone, somewhere, might be endeavoring to reassemble them to test the blood, to unlock the light. And if they succeed, then immortality will cease to be a myth. It will become a potent weapon. It invariably culminates in this, not a luminous cup upon a table, not a knight returning from a pilgrimage, not a final, triumphant crusade, but silence, systematic suppression, and deliberate erasure. Whenever the intricate trail of the Grail begins to coalesce into something tangible, something demonstrably real, the records inexplicably vanish, the witnesses perish, the churches are consumed by fire, the scrolls are officially proscribed. This occurs not by accident, but by authoritative decree. Now that the comprehensive panorama has been presented, one begins to comprehend the immense scale of what necessitated concealment. This was not merely about heresy. It was never solely about orthodoxy or blasphemy. It was about profound containment. A relic, if it truly existed, capable of activation under specific conditions, blood, frequency, spiritual readiness, would represent an existential threat to every established structure of power. It would not merely offer eternal life, it would fundamentally invalidate death. It would dissolve fear. And fear, as has become evident, serves as the preferred instrument of both popes and kings. The pattern has already been observed. The Cathars possessed a fragment of the truth. They were systematically annihilated, not merely persecuted, but exterminated. The Inquisition pursued the survivors with a fervor unmatched even by the Crusades. Their transgression, a theology centered on light, a steadfast refusal to submit to the dogma of sin and penance. They believed in spiritual awakening, that the soul could return to its origin, luminous and eternal, obviating any need for priests or sacraments. And they may have possessed the relic to corroborate this belief. The Templars, despite all their vows and veiled practices, may have commenced as guardians, but they too concluded as heretics. Their writings, scarce as they are, allude to beliefs utterly irreconcilable with church doctrine, not merely concerning Christ, but regarding the fundamental nature of life itself. They spoke of profound transformation, of the divine residing within, of something slumbering in the blood. Such concepts, one realizes, were far from conventional monastic contemplation. When the French crown turned against them, and the Pope subsequently acquiesced, it was not driven by piety. It was driven by fear. Fear of what the order might reveal, what powers they might unleash. The accusations leveled against them were absurd: spitting on the cross, idol worship, kissing strange heads. Yet, beneath the parody, a deeper terror lingered that they had discovered something ancient, and it was no longer under ecclesiastical control. One recalls Jacques de Molay, one recalls the flame. His final words, a blend of curse and confession, continue to resonate. He spoke of a light that could not be extinguished, of a fire that would return, of something too sacred for mere stone walls. And what of the relic itself? The available evidence suggests it did not remain in a single location. It was deliberately moved, perhaps fragmented, concealed in regions hostile to European powers: Ethiopia, Armenia, the mountains of southern France. This was done not to protect it from discovery, but to shield the world from its potential misuse. The escape from Mont Sager remains one of the most chilling episodes in this saga. A treasure smuggled out under siege, vanishing irrevocably. And then, nothing, not a trace, just profound silence until modern times. Now, we encounter whispers from archaeological excavations, radiation spikes in sealed tombs, reported hallucinations near Templar crypts, and Vatican insiders cautioning about relics interred beneath 30 feet of concrete and prayer. One dismisses these as mere superstition until researchers begin to disappear, until their notes are confiscated, until funding is mysteriously withdrawn. One Vatican archivist spoke anonymously about a box marked with 3 symbols: a flame, a drop of blood, and a spiral. It bore no label, no descriptive text. Only one warning was inscribed on the inventory: non tanager anima, do not touch without a pure soul. This is poetic until one realizes its implicit meaning, that someone did indeed touch it, that someone did attempt. If the Grail was real, and all indications now suggest it was, then what became of it? Was it destroyed, disassembled, or is it patiently awaiting? Not within a chalice on an altar, but encoded within patterns, within lineage, and within specific frequencies, waiting for an individual possessing the correct blood, the appropriate consciousness, and the precise timing. The disquieting possibility is that it is not lost at all, that it was never truly gone, only dormant. The breadcrumbs have been followed, they have been held to the fire. What flickers in their shadows has been observed. The Templars did not fail. They did not succumb. They deliberately concealed the Grail, not solely to protect it, but to defer its reawakening until humanity was deemed ready. Are we? One pauses, sensing that peculiar prickling behind the eyes. That breath one was unconsciously holding, that intrinsic part of oneself that questions whether these narratives, these fragments, these ancient obsessions were always destined to reach us, not for entertainment, but as a test. For perhaps the relic resides not in a vault or beneath a chapel. Perhaps it resides within the very act of its telling, and perhaps, just perhaps, someone has already begun to remember. Thus, the knowledge has been conveyed, or rather, it has been glimpsed. What commenced as a conventional narrative concerning a cup, knights, quests, and secret ceremonies has unfolded into something more profound and enigmatic. It is not merely history, but memory. It is not merely myth, but a whisper patiently awaiting in the ancient bones of time. The winding path through Antioch and Montaigut has been traversed, through burned manuscripts and stone chapels that resonate when illuminated just so. Encounters have been made with knights who concealed more than gold, and priests who harbored trepidation concerning what could not be preached. It has been observed how truth distorts in the presence of power, how relics transform into metaphors until they revert to their true nature. And now, at the conclusion of this inquiry, the fire has diminished, the voices have receded. Yet, the questions persist, do they not? Soft as ash, yet weighty as stone. What if the intention was never to reveal the Grail, What if the intention was for it to discover you? Allow this thought to gently reside for now. Let it settle within, a warm and flickering presence. It will not extinguish, nor will it clamor for attention. It is patient. It waits. The night has deepened. The wind outside carries no more explicit names. And somewhere, in a chapel no longer identifiable on any map, something ancient rests beneath intricately carved stars and forgotten hymns. No one guards it. No one needs to. Its custodian is time itself. And time, unlike human endeavor, does not forget. We trust this extensive exploration has been illuminating. We encourage continued reflection upon these profound insights.